There's a question that doesn't announce itself loudly. It doesn't arrive with a dramatic headline or a single memorable date. It creeps in quietly, the way certain ideas do when you're lying still in the dark and your mind starts pulling at threads. The question is this: what if the things we assume are permanent are actually the most fragile things of all? Think about the great civilizations of the past. Not their collapses, not the dramatic final moments, but the ordinary people living inside them, generation after generation, who simply assumed the system around them would continue. The farmers who assumed the taxes would be collected and the roads would be maintained. The merchants who assumed the trade routes would stay open. The priests and scribes and administrators who assumed the whole architecture of their world was simply how things were. Then, over decades or sometimes centuries, quietly and without a single decisive moment, it wasn't anymore. This is a video about that, about the endings that don't feel like endings until long after they've happened. About the pattern that keeps showing up across wildly different cultures, wildly different centuries, wildly different continents. And there is a pattern. That's the claim we're going to test tonight. Now, before we go further, let me be clear about what I mean when I use the word reset. I'm not using it to mean total destruction. Civilizations rarely just vanish. People survive. Knowledge survives sometimes. What resets is the organizing system, the network of trade, taxation, administration, and shared belief that holds a complex society together. When that network breaks down, what follows isn't a blank slate. It's fragmentation and then reorganization, and then eventually a new consolidation around different centers, different rules, sometimes different languages and gods. That full arc from working system to breakdown to reorganization is what I'm calling a reset, and we're going to look at quite a few of them. But here's the thing that keeps coming back, the thread that runs through the Bronze Age collapse, through the fall of Akkad, through the slow quieting of the Indus Valley cities, through Rome in the west, through the Maya, through the great dynasties of China, through the Khmer at Angkor, and further still. Across all of these, separated by thousands of years and thousands of miles, there's something that rhymes. Not an identical cause, not a single villain, not one tidy explanation. History doesn't work that way, and anyone who tells you it does is selling you a story that's neater than the evidence. But a pattern, yes, a recurring shape in how complex societies reach their limits and then tip. We'll build toward that pattern together. We're going to go through the case studies first, one by one, letting the evidence accumulate before we start drawing lines between them. That feels like the right way to do this, because if you jump to the theory before you've sat with the examples, the theory floats untethered, and you can make almost any theory fit a few cherry-picked facts. We're going to earn the conclusion, and I want to be honest with you about what we won't have. We won't have certainty in a lot of places. The historical record is uneven. Some of these societies left us enormous archives. Others left us almost nothing but ruins and climate data. Where the evidence is thin, I'll tell you it's thin. Where historians genuinely disagree, I'll give you the disagreement rather than a false consensus. Evidence first, then responsible interpretation, and we'll hold the big claims lightly. Now, if you're using this to fall asleep, then you're exactly who I made it for. The pace here is meant to be calm. The images I want to conjure for you are vivid but gentle, distant civilizations seen through soft light, landscapes changing over centuries, the slow tide of history rather than the sharp shock of it. There's a lot of ground to cover, but we're not in a hurry. Let the ideas wash over you. If you drift off somewhere in the middle of the Indus Valley, that's fine. The pattern will still be here when you come back. Before we get into it, I want to ask you something, and I genuinely want to know. Where are you listening from right now, and what time is it? Drop it in the comments. Last time I asked something like this, it was Berlin at breakfast and Boston at bedtime, all in the same thread. And there's something quietly wonderful about that. All these different people in different time zones, letting the same history settle over them in the dark or the early morning, or the long middle of a restless night. So here's the road ahead. We're going to start by agreeing on what we mean by civilization and what makes something count as a collapse, rather than just a change. Then we'll walk through the case studies across eras. Then we'll name the shared pattern directly. And finally, we'll ask the question that's been sitting underneath all of it from the beginning. The quiet one that doesn't announce itself. Whether the pattern might have something to say about right now. Let's begin. Before we can look at the pattern, we need to agree on what we're actually looking at. And that means starting with two words that get used constantly and defined almost never: civilization and collapse. Let's take civilization first. When historians use the word, they're not usually making a value judgment. They're not saying one group of people was more refined or more worthy than another. They're describing a particular kind of social arrangement. A civilization, in the sense we'll be using throughout, is a network. Networks of cities or dense settlements, yes, but more specifically, networks of exchange, record-keeping, and institutional coordination. The three things that tend to show up together, that tend to define the threshold where a society becomes something more than a collection of villages, a writing or some equivalent information system, organized long-distance trade, and institutions that persist beyond the lifetimes of individuals. That last one is worth pausing on. An institution that persists beyond individual lifetimes is something genuinely extraordinary in biological terms. It means the group has developed a way to store agreements, obligations, and expectations outside of any single person's memory. A tax system does this. A priesthood does this. A grain storage registry does this. Even a standardized set of weights and measures does this, because it encodes a shared understanding that strangers can rely on without having to negotiate from scratch every single time they meet. When you have cities and trade and writing and institutions that outlive individuals, you have a civilization in the working sense we'll use here. You have complexity. And complexity, as we're going to see over and over again, is both the thing that makes these societies extraordinarily capable and the thing that makes them extraordinarily fragile. Now, what about collapse? This is where popular history tends to go wrong in a particular, almost seductive way. We love the dramatic ending, the city in flames, the last emperor, the single battle that decided everything. And sometimes those things happen. But when you look at the actual archaeological and historical record, what you find much more often is something slower and stranger. Something less like a building falling and more like a building quietly becoming uninhabitable, room by room, floor by floor, until one day you realize nobody's been living in it for a generation. What we're calling a reset is more precisely a phase shift. Complexity drops. The network that was holding the system together becomes thinner, or snaps in a few critical places, and suddenly the whole architecture begins to simplify. Trade routes contract. Administrative records stop being kept. Monumental building projects are abandoned mid-construction, sometimes literally with the tools still there. Populations in urban centres decline or disperse. The information flows that kept the whole thing coordinated start breaking down. But here's the crucial thing. This is almost never total, and it's almost never simultaneous everywhere. The collapse of the Bronze Age world around 1200 BCE devastated palace economies from Greece to Anatolia to the Levant. But Egypt survived in a diminished form. The fall of the Western Roman Empire in the 5th century CE left the eastern half intact for another 1,000 years. The abandonment of major Indus Valley cities seems to have been gradual, regional, and apparently peaceful in ways that still puzzle researchers. Collapse, real historical collapse, is partial. It's uneven. Some regions go down hard while others adapt, absorb refugees, and eventually reorganize around new centers of gravity. This unevenness is actually important evidence. It tells us that what fails isn't usually the people, and it isn't usually the land. What fails is a particular configuration of systems. Change the configuration, lose the complexity, and eventually a new configuration emerges from the pieces. Which brings us to a trap that's claimed more than a few otherwise careful thinkers. The monocausal explanation. Drought did it. Invasion did it. Disease did it. Economic inequality did it. Climate change did it. Each of these explanations has real evidence behind it in specific cases, and each of them, on its own, is almost certainly incomplete, because civilizations are not simple machines with a single load-bearing part. They're more like ecosystems, multiple systems interacting, compensating for each other's weaknesses, creating feedback loops both stabilizing and destabilizing. When a complex society tips into a reset, it's almost always because several things are failing at once, and the combination overwhelms the system's ability to compensate. A drought that would be manageable in a society with robust grain reserves and flexible trade networks becomes catastrophic in one where the grain reserves have been depleted by years of elite extraction, and the trade networks are already strained by political fragmentation. The drought didn't cause the collapse. The drought was the last weight on a scale that was already leaning badly. Take out the drought, and something else probably tips it. The pattern is in the loading of the scale, not in the final weight. This is why multi-factor models fit the evidence consistently better than single-cause narratives. Not because historians lack the courage to make a definitive claim, but because the evidence genuinely points toward interaction effects rather than prime movers. So if we're not looking for a single cause, what are we looking for? Throughout this series, we're going to be looking at 5 interlocking systems. Think of them as the systems that any complex society has to keep running simultaneously to stay complex. The first is food and energy. How does the society feed itself and power its work? Every civilization rests on an agricultural or resource base, and the relationship between that base and the demands placed on it is one of the most reliable early warning signals we have. The second is governance. How does the society make collective decisions, maintain order, and coordinate large-scale action? This includes military capacity, but it's much broader than that. It's the whole architecture of administration, law, and enforcement. The third is trade and exchange. How do goods, resources, and information move across the network? Trade is both an economic function and a social one. It's how distant communities stay connected, how specialization becomes possible, and how shocks in one region get distributed rather than concentrated. The fourth is information. How does the society record, transmit, and act on knowledge? Writing is the obvious example, but this includes all the ways a complex society maintains its own memory, its accounting systems, its religious and legal texts, its maps and censuses and archives. And the fifth is legitimacy. How does the society justify the arrangement of power? Why do people accept that this group collects taxes, that this institution has authority, that this particular hierarchy is the natural order of things? Legitimacy is often the last thing to fail and the first thing people forget to study. But it may be the most important system of all, because when legitimacy collapses, the others can't hold even if they're technically still functioning. These 5 systems are not independent. They feed each other, stress each other, and fail each other. A food crisis strains governance. A governance crisis disrupts trade. A trade disruption reduces the information flows that keep the system coordinated. And all of it eats away at legitimacy, which is really just another name for the shared agreement that the whole arrangement is worth maintaining. The goal here is not to prove a grand unified theory of civilizational collapse. Anyone offering you that with total confidence is simplifying in ways that should make you nervous. The goal is more modest, but I think more honest. We're trying to identify a repeating sequence. a pattern in how these 5 systems interact as a civilization approaches its limits, a pattern that shows up across enough different cases in enough different times and places that it starts to look like something structural rather than coincidental. We're doing this inductively, case by case, evidence first, theory second. By the time we've walked through the Bronze Age, and Akkad and Egypt's intermediate periods, and the Indus Valley and the Maya and Rome and the Chinese dynastic cycle, and the Khmer, and the Black Death, and the early modern reshuffling of global trade, you'll have enough examples in your mind that the pattern will start to suggest itself. That's the experience I'm trying to build toward. And then at the end we'll ask the uncomfortable question, whether we can see the same sequence beginning to run in our own moment, not as prophecy, not as doom, but as a way of seeing clearly, which is the only honest place to start if you want to think carefully about what comes next. For now, though, the ancient world is waiting, and the first case we're going to look at is one of the most dramatic, most studied, and most genuinely mysterious breakdowns in all of recorded history. A moment around 1200 BCE when an entire interconnected system of palace economies simply stopped. Not in one place, but almost everywhere at once, across a span of only a few decades. Historians are still arguing about why, and the argument itself turns out to be one of the most illuminating things about how complex systems fail. Before we dive into specific civilizations, we need one more piece of scaffolding, a working idea about what goes wrong in complex societies, not as a single cause, but as a pattern you can watch for in the background. Think of it as the default setting of large-scale organization, the thing that keeps reappearing whenever humans build something big enough that strangers start ruling strangers. We can start with a simple, almost boring observation. To govern at scale, you have to be able to see. Not see in the literal sense of looking out a palace window, but see in the sense of making an enormous tangle of people and fields and obligations understandable from a few central desks. How many people live where? Who owes what? How much grain is coming in this year? How many soldiers can be raised from that district? Which canal needs repair? Which temple needs funding? Which road brings in the most trade? Left to themselves, villages and households produce their own forms of order. Local planting calendars, customary rights to water, neighbours who know who's reliable and who isn't. But from the standpoint of a central administration, all of that is messy, unpredictable, and hard to tax. So every civilization, from the first city-states in Mesopotamia to modern bureaucratic states, ends up doing some version of the same thing. They try to make reality legible. They draw boundaries on maps that ignore older, fuzzier local zones of use. They assign numbers to people in censuses. They standardize weights and measures. They define official categories of land, of crops, of labor, of status. They turn a living patchwork of practices into neat columns in an archive. This isn't necessarily sinister. In its early stages, it can feel like progress. Clear rules instead of improvisation. Predictable taxes instead of arbitrary demands. Written contracts instead of relying on whether the local strongman keeps his promises. When you have legibility, you can build roads, coordinate irrigation, provision armies, and move food from surplus regions to famine-struck ones. Legibility enables extraction, but it also enables protection. And here's where the bargain begins. A state, at its healthiest, is a set of bargains. You give us grain, labour, obedience. We give you security, infrastructure, dispute resolution, sometimes even a shared identity that makes you us rather than them. At first, when things are going well, this can be a pretty good trade, especially after a period of chaos or war. Having a power that can keep the roads safe and the bandits in check is not a trivial benefit. People will often accept higher taxes and tighter rules if the value they get in return feels real. But legibility and extraction don't stop there. Once a system exists to count and tax, there is always pressure to count and tax more. Rulers change. Dynasties come and go. Ambitious kings want new monuments, larger armies, more splendid courts. Officials want salaries. Temples want offerings. Palaces want luxury goods from far away. As the central apparatus becomes more complex, the number of people who live off that apparatus grows with it. Clerks, scribes, inspectors, accountants, messengers, tax farmers, judges, garrison commanders, overseers of irrigation, overseers of granaries, overseers of the overseers. Each layer expects to be fed by the system beneath it. So over time, in civilization after civilization, we see the same drift. More categories, more regulations, more assessments. Land that used to be taxed at one rate is reclassified. Exemptions are removed, new levies appear. What was once a light skim off the top becomes something heavier. Meanwhile, the benefits of the system are not distributed evenly. The roads may get better, but they tend to connect capital cities, not remote villages. The granaries may protect against famine, but access to those reserves often runs through patrons, priests, and officials who can favour some and exclude others. Armies protect the realm, but they can just as easily be used to enforce extraction. As complexity rises, the distance between cost and benefit widens. At the top, the system looks efficient and rational. Great projects can be planned. Armies can be mobilized. Taxes can be projected decades into the future. At the bottom, the same system starts to feel like a weight. Each new census feels less like coordination and more like surveillance. Each new declaration of reform feels like another excuse to squeeze. This divergence doesn't immediately cause collapse. Civilizations can run for centuries with a high level of extraction. People adapt, grumble, find ways to cope. Local elites mediate. Priests tell stories that justify the hierarchy. As long as daily life is bearable and the future feels somewhat predictable, the bargain, though strained, holds. The real test comes when shocks arrive, a run of bad harvests. A new epidemic, a costly war, a migration wave, an earthquake that ruins key infrastructure. Sometimes several of these at once. In a healthy system, shocks are absorbed. Reserves are drawn down. Taxes may even be relaxed to let people recover. Local networks and central institutions work together to spread the blow. In a system where extraction and overhead have been rising for generations, shocks hit a very different structure. There are fewer reserves, because surplus has already been committed to debt, luxury, or previous crises. There is less slack in the system, because every part of it has been working near capacity to meet obligations. And there is less patience among those being taxed, because the memory of more generous times is fading. When the drought comes, but the tax collector still arrives at the same rate or higher. When the enemy invades, but the army turns out to be underfunded and disorganized despite years of heavy levies. When the plague arrives, and the infrastructure that was supposed to be the reward for obedience turns out to be brittle or corrupt. That's when the bargain starts to break. There is another piece that usually moves with this: information. Civilizations don't just coordinate resources, they coordinate stories. Stories about why the king rules, why the gods favour this order, why the current suffering is temporary and meaningful. Why paying your share now will be rewarded later. These stories work for a long time, because they're not totally false. Early victories, real public works, genuine relief in past disasters give people reasons to believe. Even when things go badly, if the official narrative stays close enough to lived experience, people will often hold on. But bureaucracies lag. Courts write in formulas long after conditions have changed. Propaganda repeats old victories while current defeats pile up. Tax codes assume normal harvests in years that are anything but normal. Officials insist that all is under control, when everyone can see that it isn't. You end up with a widening gap between what the centre says is happening and what the periphery is actually living. This is where the pattern sharpens into something almost tactile. You can feel it in the historical record as a kind of narrative strain. Edicts reminding people of duties that used to be assumed, harsh punishments for desertion or tax evasion, religious reforms that try to recentralize belief, appeals to tradition that feel oddly anxious. Underneath that, something quieter is happening. People start to trust different things. They turn to local gods instead of imperial cults, to clan leaders instead of provincial governors, to village militias instead of royal armies, to informal markets and smuggling routes instead of official trade, to oral agreements instead of written contracts that are no longer enforced fairly. The crucial break is not just economic or military. It's in where people believe safety and meaning live. We can call this the trust fracture. It doesn't require open rebellion, though sometimes it leads there. It can look like slow disengagement, a village that withholds part of its taxes and dares the officials to come, a regional commander who doesn't fully obey orders from the capital, merchants who quietly reroute caravans away from roads patrolled by unreliable soldiers, families who hedge their bets by maintaining ties to multiple power centres at once. From the centre, this may appear suddenly, as if people have become ungrateful or disobedient overnight. From the ground, it feels like a rational adjustment. The promises that once made the state worth supporting are no longer credible. So support shifts to smaller, more immediate networks where trust still has a track record. Legitimacy, in other words, migrates. Once that migration is far enough along, a civilization can remain standing on paper. Offices still exist, titles are still used, laws are still proclaimed. But the living coordination has moved elsewhere. And then, when a sufficiently large shock arrives, the impressive facade can crumble with surprising speed. In the sections ahead, we're going to watch this pattern play out in very different settings. In the late Bronze Age, palace economies that had made everything legible through tablets and rations, trying to hold a world together as climate, trade, and war all shift at once. In Mesopotamia, the first empires discovering the limits of how much can be extracted from irrigated fields before the land and the people push back. In Egypt, periods when provincial officials quietly become more important than pharaohs whose names still appear on monuments. In the Indus Valley, where the story might be one of voluntary simplification rather than outright collapse, a trust fracture without obvious violence. Among the Maya, where prestige competition among elites strains the very systems that keep cities alive. In Rome and China and Angkor, where legibility reaches extraordinary heights and then has to reckon with its own overhead. Each case will complicate the pattern. None will fit it perfectly. That's the point. As you listen, you can keep this quiet question running in the background. Where is legibility increasing, and for whose benefit? How heavy has extraction become? What stories are being told from the centre? And how well do they match the archaeology of daily life? Where, if anywhere, can we see trust beginning to migrate from imperial promises to local arrangements? By the time we return to our own era, with its fossil fuels and global data networks and intricate bureaucracies, you may find that the old pattern has not gone away. It has simply changed its clothing. By the late Bronze Age, around 1300 BCE, the Eastern Mediterranean and Near East looked, in some ways, more connected than anything the world had seen before. If you could drift above it, not with satellites, but with the quiet eye of hindsight, you'd see a web. At one node, the great palaces of Egypt's new kingdom, feeding off the Nile's steady rhythm. At another, the Hittite capital of Hattusa, in central Anatolia, its walls wrapped around storerooms of grain and archives of clay tablets. To the east, the Kassite rulers in Babylon. To the north and west, Mycenaean palaces in Greece, perched on hills, their meagerons painted with scenes of chariots and feasts. Between them, ships moving along regular sea lanes, carrying copper from Cyprus, tin from far-off sources, timber from Lebanon, luxury goods like ivory, glass, fine textiles. On land, caravans crossing Syria and Canaan, bringing lapis from Afghanistan, horses from the steppe, silver from Anatolian mines. This was not a world of isolated kingdoms. It was an interlocking system. Elites married across borders. The kings of Egypt and the Hittites addressed each other as brother in diplomatic letters. They sent daughters as wives, gold as gifts, promises as glue. There was a shared language of power. Chariots, bronze weapons, palatial architecture, gods whose names could be translated from one pantheon into another. Underneath that glittering surface, the machinery that made it all possible was deeply centralized. Palace economies sat on top of agricultural landscapes like huge administrative engines. Fields were measured, harvests assessed. Grain flowed into state granaries, was recorded on tablets, and then flowed back out again as rations. Workers, soldiers, craftsmen and dependents were all tied into this system. In places like Ugarit on the Syrian coast, tablets record shipments of grain, oil and textiles moving in and out with a precision that would please any modern accountant. Scribal schools taught the formulas. Weights and measures were standardized. Labour obligations were scheduled. Taxes were not paid in some vague sense, but in specific quantities at specific times, monitored by specific officials. Legibility and extraction had reached a sophisticated balance. If you were a palace, this was a dream. You could see your realm in numbers. How many plough oxen, how many chariot teams, how much bronze in your workshops. You could forecast. You could plan campaigns, build temples, send embassies with confidence that the grain would be there to feed the messengers. If you were a farmer at the edge of this system, the view was more mixed. On one hand, the palace might protect you from raiders, settle disputes, keep irrigation channels cleared, and occasionally distribute food in hard times. Being registered meant being visible, and being visible could mean being defended. On the other hand, registration also meant ration lists, corvée labour, conscription. It meant your surplus was not entirely your own. Your sons might be called to war, your daughters to work in temple complexes, your best fields folded into estates claimed by the king or his favourites. Still, for centuries, the bargain more or less held. The late Bronze Age system didn't arise overnight. It was the product of gradual layering. Each kingdom built on earlier traditions of kingship and redistribution, adding chariots here, diplomatic protocol there, ever more elaborate archives to keep it all straight. Then, around 1200 BCE, the web began to shake. What followed is sometimes called the Bronze Age collapse, but historians are careful here. It wasn't a single event, and it didn't look the same everywhere. It was a generation or two of cascading failures across a tightly coupled system. The stresses came from several directions at once. There is evidence for climate variability, especially around the eastern Mediterranean. Pollen records and sediment cores suggest that parts of the region experienced a shift toward drier conditions. Not a planet-wide cataclysm, but enough to make marginal lands less reliable, harvests more uncertain. Letters from the time speak of famine. In one, a Hittite king begs the ruler of Ugarit for grain, warning that we will die of hunger if supplies do not arrive. In another, an Egyptian official boasts of filling granaries during good years to ward off future scarcity. These are not abstract worries. They are responses to real, if uneven, shortfalls. There is also evidence for earthquakes. Archaeologists have identified a seismic belt along which several sites show signs of destruction consistent with tremors. Walls toppled in a particular pattern, floors cracked in ways that fire and warfare alone don't explain. The idea of an earthquake storm sweeping the region is debated, but it seems likely that at least some major centres were hit by the ground itself shifting under them. On top of this, we have clear signs of conflict. Cities along the Levantine coast show layers of burning and destruction. Fortifications are smashed, palaces gutted. Egyptian inscriptions speak of invasions by groups we label, somewhat vaguely, the Sea Peoples, confederations of migrants and raiders arriving by land and sea. In some regions, especially in the Aegean, there is evidence of internal unrest as well, signs that palaces were attacked from within as much as from without. And then, in the bureaucracy's own handwriting, we see piracy and lawlessness creep into the record. Letters from Ugarit mention ships of enemies seizing cargoes. Governors complain that they can no longer guarantee safe passage along routes that used to be secure. None of these stressors taken alone was necessarily fatal. Droughts had happened before. Earthquakes were not new. Wars and raids were part of the normal background of Bronze Age politics. What changed was the structure they hit. These were palace economies tuned to a narrow band of predictability. Their ledgers assumed that grain would continue to flow in at known rates. Their ration systems assumed that workers would keep turning up for duty, that soldiers would be fed, that trade partners would honour contracts. Their fleets and chariot corps required ongoing supplies of bronze, horses, trained specialists. To keep that running, extraction had climbed steadily. More lands tied to the palace, more people registered as dependents. More obligations counted and enforced. The sheer weight of the administrative apparatus meant that there was not much slack in the system. When climate pushed harvests down even a little, when a few trade routes became dangerous, when an earthquake knocked out a key port or storage complex, the palace couldn't simply shrug and scale back. The commitments were already baked in. Ration lists had names on them. Soldiers expected pay, scribes expected grain, foreign courts expected shipments of gold and fine goods as the price of peace. So we start to see the trust fracture open. Ordinary people, facing real scarcity, still saw tax collectors arriving. Corvée labour was still demanded. Governors still sent orders. But the protective side of the bargain, secure trade, reliable food distributions, effective defences grew patchier. In some places, local strongmen stepped into the gap, shifting from being agents of the palace to being power centres in their own right. A fort commander who refused to send his full quota of troops to a distant king. A village headman who held back grain from the official granary to protect his own people first. Elsewhere, whole groups seem to have chosen movement over submission. Migrations from the north and west, and perhaps from the Aegean, pushed into the already stressed zones of Anatolia and the Levant. Some of these migrants may be the people later described as Sea Peoples. Their exact origins are still debated, and the label itself hides a lot of variety. But the pattern is clear: populations on the move, testing borders that were no longer solid. From the point of view of a palace, this would have looked like sudden treachery and chaos. Vassals failing to answer summons, garrisons deserting, caravans not arriving, coastal towns switching allegiance or simply burning. From the ground, it was more likely a set of careful incremental decisions. If the king could no longer keep the roads safe, you trusted the man with the local militia instead. If the official granaries were empty or guarded by soldiers who favoured their own clients, you hid your grain or gave it to someone closer who promised protection. Legitimacy migrated downward and sideways over the span of a few decades. Some of the key nodes of the old system simply failed. The Hittite capital was abandoned. Mycenaean palaces in Greece were destroyed or deserted. Ugarit, with its rich archives, went up in flames and was never rebuilt as a major centre. Egypt survived, but even there, the Ramesside pharaohs after Ramesses III presided over a thinner, poorer, more defensive state. The aftermath varied by region, but certain threads keep appearing. In many areas, long-distance trade shrank. the elaborate circulation of tin, copper and luxury materials that had fed the palace workshops slowed dramatically or rerouted through different, smaller-scale channels. Archaeological layers from the early Iron Age show fewer imported goods in inland sites, more local, simpler pottery. Literacy, which had been concentrated in palatial bureaucracies, declined with them. Cuneiform archives disappear from many places. Writing doesn't vanish entirely. New scripts like the early alphabetic systems emerge and spread, but the density of written records drops. The voice of the centralized archive goes quiet, and we're left listening to smaller, more fragmented echoes. Yet this was not the end of civilization. It was a reset of terms. New polities emerged over the following centuries. The Aramaean city-states, the Neo-Hittite kingdoms, the early kingdoms of Israel and Judah, later the Neo-Assyrian Empire. They rebuilt trade, re-established order, and developed their own systems of legibility and extraction. But the bargains they offered were not quite the same as the old palace redistributive model. Some leaned more on local elites and city councils. Some integrated tribal structures into their rule. Some experimented with new forms of recording and law. The late Bronze Age collapse in this reading is not just a story of things falling apart. It's an early, vivid example of what happens when a highly interconnected, high-overhead system encounters multiple shocks at once, with little slack and little trust left to absorb them. In the next section, we'll go back a little further in time, to Sumer and Akkad, and watch an earlier experiment in imperial extraction run up against the hard limits of land, labour and legitimacy. Different scale, different setting, but the same quiet questions underneath. Who sees whom? Who carries the weight? And what happens when the promises at the top no longer match the realities at the bottom? To see those questions more clearly, we have to wind the clock back more than half a millennium before the Bronze Age web we just left. Back to a flatter floodplain, fewer chariots, smaller horizons. Back to the first people who tried to turn scattered cities into something like an empire. Southern Mesopotamia, around 2500 to 2200 BCE, looked very different from the wooded hills and coastal harbours of the late Bronze Age. This was a low-lying plain between the Tigris and Euphrates, braided with canals and seasonal channels, bounded by drier lands to the north and west. In later myths, it's the land of Shinar, of Sumer, of the first cities. If you drifted down close, you wouldn't see one capital ruling everything. You'd see a necklace of city-states, Uruk, Lagash, Umma, Nippur, Kish. Each one a compact world, a temple complex at the centre. Storage rooms clustered nearby, houses pressed around them, then out beyond the walls, fields and irrigation ditches stretching away until they blurred into steppe. Each city had its own patron god, its own priesthood, its own king or governor. Each had scribes writing in cuneiform, recording deliveries of barley, distributions of wool, assignments of labour. From a distance they shared a culture. Up close they argued over boundaries, water rights, prestige. This is where some of the earliest clearly documented extraction systems take shape. Temples weren't just places of worship, they were economic engines. Fields were dedicated to the god, worked by dependents who received rations of grain and beer. Herds were counted, looms were installed in large weaving halls where women spun and wove cloth for redistribution. Later, kings layered themselves on top of this temple economy. Royal inscriptions from Lagash and elsewhere boast of digging canals, building walls, conquering neighbours. But the quiet work of the state happened in the tablet rooms. Clay tablets from this period read like spreadsheets. How many gur of barley from which field? How many days of corvée labour assigned to which canal project? Which shepherd is responsible for which flock? Temple and palace were learning to see their world as columns and rows. This legibility was not accidental. Southern Mesopotamia was a difficult place to rule without it. The soil was fertile, but only with careful water control. Too little irrigation and crops failed, too much for too long, and salts in the groundwater crept upward, whitening the fields, poisoning the land. Modern scholars still debate how severe salinization became, and how quickly. Some argue that it played a major role in long-term decline. Others caution that the evidence is patchy, the timelines uncertain. What is clear is that managing water and soil was a constant delicate task. Canals had to be cleared of silt. Embankments had to be maintained. Water had to be released and shut off at the right times, not just for one field, but for whole networks of fields, often spanning multiple village jurisdictions. If you were a farmer at the tail end of a canal, your life depended on decisions made upstream. A city that controlled the headwaters of an irrigation network could turn valves on its neighbours. It could flood their fields at the wrong time, or starve them of water during a crucial growing period. Many of the wars between Sumerian city-states seem, at least in part, to have been about this, not abstract power, but who got the water when. In this environment, early imperial administration promised something tempting: coordination. When Sargon of Akkad, around 2330 BCE, began conquering city after city, he wasn't stepping into a vacuum. He was inserting himself into an existing mesh of temple estates, local councils, irrigation bureaus, and scribal schools. What he added was scale. Akkad, the city that gave his empire its name, hasn't been securely located archaeologically, but its political footprint is unmistakable. Inscriptions claim rule from the Upper Sea to the Lower Sea, usually interpreted as from somewhere near the Mediterranean to the Persian Gulf. Later boastfulness? Probably. But there is decent evidence that Akkadian authority at least touched large stretches of northern Mesopotamia and parts of Syria and Elam. To make that more than poetry, the Akkadian kings had to do what all empires try to do: turn distant communities into predictable sources of grain, labour, and loyalty. They stationed governors in conquered cities. They took hostages from local elites. They demanded regular tribute, sometimes in silver, often in staple goods. They drew off soldiers for campaigns far from home. They set up royal inscriptions in stone and on clay, reminding everyone who now held ultimate authority. Underneath the rhetoric, the work was the same as in Sumerian city-states, just stretched over a larger area, counting, scheduling, enforcing. Palace scribes in Akkadian-administered regions recorded deliveries of barley and oil in the same dense, formulaic style as their southern counterparts. Temple complexes continue to function, but now under the watchful eye of royal appointees. The empire's promises went beyond piety. It offered protection for trade routes, security for caravans moving wool and metals and timber across dangerous zones. This was crucial. Akkad sat between richer agricultural lands and resource frontiers, mountains with stone and metals, steppe zones with nomadic herders, distant forests with timber. To feed an expanding army and administrative class, the kings needed more than local fields. They needed flows, so the imperial story ran like this: submit, pay, serve, and in return, the centre will keep the roads safe, settle disputes between cities, coordinate irrigation on a regional scale, and keep hostile outsiders at bay. It's the same bargain, in miniature, that we saw centuries later in the Bronze Age palaces. But Mesopotamia added another constraint, more immediate than earthquakes or far-off famines: volatility on the frontier. To the north and east, hill peoples and rival polities watched Akkad's rise with interest. To the west, the steppe and semi-arid zones were home to mobile groups, for whom fixed field boundaries meant less than access to pastures and wells. Later sources call some of these groups Gutians, among other names. Their exact identities are murky, but the pattern is familiar: pastoralists and highland communities interacting with, raiding and sometimes serving settled states. As long as the Akkadian centre could protect caravans and border settlements, this frontier remained, if not calm, at least manageable. Mobile groups could be hired as auxiliary troops, given grazing rights, folded into the system. The trouble came when strain built up inside the empire itself. We have hints, not a full record. A series of drought episodes appears in some climate reconstructions for northern Mesopotamia and the broader Near East around the late Akkadian period. Sediment cores and dust records suggest that parts of the region experienced drier conditions. How severe, how widespread, and exactly when are all debated. It was likely uneven. Still, imagine what even a few bad years in a row would mean for a system that relied on steady grain tribute from many different regions. Local officials now had to choose: fulfill the quota demanded by the imperial capital or feed their own people first. Farmers whose fields produced less might still face the same tax in kind. Irrigation networks, stretched by previous expansions into more marginal lands, now looked less like safety and more like overreach. The archaeological record shows signs of contraction in some formerly thriving northern sites after the Akkadian period. Urban populations thin. Some settlements are abandoned. Temple and palace archives go silent. From the point of view of a distant farmer or village leader, another, quieter change would have been just as important. The empire's promises no longer matched its delivery. Caravans were raided more often. Governors' messengers arrived late, or not at all. Border garrisons failed to respond quickly to threats. Water disputes went unresolved. When local people appealed upward, the centre replied with more demands, not more help. When the centre can't enforce contracts, the meaning of obligation shifts. A merchant whose load of wool is robbed on the road now looks to his local patron for redress, not to the king in akkad. A canal supervisor decides that, this year, he will open the gates in favour of nearby villages who can protect him, even if that means shorting fields legally tied to a distant temple. A town on the frontier decides to strike its own bargain with the raiders just beyond its walls. Legitimacy, again, migrates downward and sideways. Later, literary sources from southern Mesopotamia portray the fall of Akkad as a moral drama. Kings become arrogant, neglect the gods, and the Gutians sweep in as a divine punishment. These stories are full of theological explanation and poetic detail. They tell us how later people wanted to remember the event as something sudden, catastrophic, and deserved. The more prosaic reading is less tidy. Political fragmentation appears. Some cities reassert local dynasties, others fall under the sway of highland groups. Trade routes reroute. The imperial language of universal rule is replaced by more modest titulature. Out of this turbulence, new configurations emerge. The so-called Third Dynasty of Ur, a few generations after Akkad's fall, rebuilds a large territorial state in southern Mesopotamia. Its kings revive and refine many of the same tools: standardized measures, central archives, intensive accounting of grain and labour. They even produce some of the most detailed bureaucratic records we have from the ancient world. But their institutions are not identical to Akkad's. They lean more heavily on written law codes. They formalize labour categories more explicitly. They experiment with different ways of balancing temple, palace, and local elites. It is reconsolidation, but on altered terms. In this sense, the Akkadian episode looks less like a straight rise and fall, and more like a test of the outer limits of early empire. How far can you stretch accounting systems designed for a city-state before the uncertainties of climate, frontier, and human trust pull them apart? How many obligations can you pile onto villages and temples before they quietly defect in place? How far can a centre claim to guarantee security when its ability to police the gaps between settled lands and mobile peoples is always partial? Mesopotamia doesn't give us a single answer. It gives us a rhythm: centralization, strain, fragmentation, reassembly. Each time, the rebuilt states remember some lessons, forget others, and add new layers of control. Later empires in the region, Assyrian, Babylonian, Persian, will push these experiments much farther. But the pattern is already visible in the mud and reeds of Sumer. In the next section, we'll drift west along the Nile to a civilization that lasted far longer than any single Mesopotamian dynasty, and watch how its own centres waxed and waned when the provinces stopped believing in the promises from the capital. Egypt looks from the outside like the counterexample to everything we've been saying. For more than 2,000 years, from the first pharaohs to the time of Ramses II, later Greeks and Egyptians remembered it as a kind of continuous order. The two lands united, the Nile rising every year, the king living God on earth, keeping the whole thing in balance. But when you zoom in on the actual history, the line is not straight. It wobbles, it breaks, it gets stitched back together again. Egyptian historians talk about the Old Kingdom, the Middle Kingdom, and the New Kingdom as three great highs of centralized power. Between them sit the so-called intermediate periods. That word intermediate sounds harmless, like an intermission between acts of a play. What it really means is this: the old way of holding the country together stopped working. The centre lost the provinces. And then, after a time of drift and fragmentation, someone figured out a new way to reknit the valley with slightly different rules. In the Old Kingdom, roughly the time of the Great Pyramids at Giza, the deal was simple and stark. The pharaoh was not just king, he was a cosmic necessity. His person guaranteed Ma'at, the ordered harmony of the world. Through him, the gods received offerings. Through him, the Nile rose, the sun sailed the sky, the dead got proper treatment in the afterlife. To support this, the state built enormous cult complexes and funeral monuments. Royal building projects needed stone, labour, food, copper tools, administrators. That meant reaching deep into the countryside. Egypt wasn't just the narrow green ribbon you might picture from a map. It was a series of provinces up and down the river, each with its own local elites, its own temples, its own small towns. Later texts call these provinces nomes, ruled by nomarchs. In the Old Kingdom, many of these officials were appointed by the king and rotated between posts. Their power flowed upward. As long as the flood stayed roughly within expected bounds and the centre could distribute grain, elite prestige and protection, this arrangement held. But the Nile is not a machine. It pulses. Modern studies of Nile flood levels, using sediment inscriptions and later records, suggest that the river's behaviour can shift over decades. There are years of high floods, years of middling ones, and sometimes strings of low floods that bite hard. Some researchers see evidence that towards the end of the Old Kingdom, around the time of the 6th dynasty, Egypt experienced a period of flood irregularity, perhaps connected to broader climate disturbances in the eastern Mediterranean. Others are more cautious and point to the patchiness of the data. What most agree on is that even a few poor floods in a row, in a system tuned to feed workers and elites as well as peasants, would have been stressful. And stress has to go somewhere. If you were a village headman in Upper Egypt in this period, your obligations came from two directions. On one side, the royal administration expected delivery of grain, manpower for building projects, and loyalty. On the other, your own people expected protection from bandits, help smoothing over disputes, maybe some grain in bad years. As long as the pharaoh's officials could send more food downriver in lean times, as long as central storehouses functioned, you could afford to prioritize the capital's demands. You could tell hungry neighbors, it's hard now, but the king provides. The system works. If shipments slowed, if the royal messengers grew scarce, That reassurance became hollow. The archaeological and textual record from the first intermediate period is fragmented, but a pattern emerges. Monumental royal building projects largely stop. Tombs and stelae in the provinces, by contrast, proliferate. Local officials begin to boast not just of serving the king, but of feeding their people, of being a shelter in the bad year. Power, and the language that justifies power, moves sideways. The centre still exists. There are competing royal lines, one in Heracleopolis, one in Thebes, but their grasp is partial. Nomarchs in places like Asyut or Elephantine start to act more like little kings. They commission fine tombs, maintain small armies, negotiate alliances and rivalries with their neighbours. The same mechanism that once allowed the crown to govern a long, thin country, delegating tasks to local elites, now works in reverse. In calm times, appointed officials are the king's eyes and hands. In stress, they are the ones with the grain in their granaries and the armed retainers at their backs. And here we see Egypt's version of the legibility problem. The pharaonic state could see some things very clearly. It could measure fields along the floodplain using rope stretchers and surveyors. It could record deliveries of grain in neat hieratic script. It could move stone from quarries hundreds of kilometres away to the royal necropolis. But the further you went from Memphis, or later from Thebes, the more those neat records blurred. Was this village really as poor as it claimed? Did that nomarch really send all the soldiers he was supposed to, or just the ones he could spare without risking his own position? Were the granaries as empty as the reports said, or was someone holding back in case the capital failed them? In a long, narrow country where practically every settlement touches the same river, but can also hide behind local patronage networks, the centre's information is always a little stale, a little incomplete. In good years, that doesn't matter much. In bad years, small inaccuracies compound. Nomarchs, by contrast, could see very sharply. They knew which hamlets were loyal, which could field archers, which had surpluses hidden away. They could calibrate their protection and their extraction at a much finer grain than the palace. As central authority stumbled, trust quietly reattached itself to those who could physically show up. If you needed justice, you went to the local official, not to a distant court. If bandits threatened the river bank, it was your provincial lord's guards you saw, not the pharaohs. If floods failed, the drought relief that mattered was whatever your local granary could muster. We might be tempted to call this collapse, but from the perspective of many provincial communities, it probably felt more like rearrangement. The names on official decrees changed. The axis of obligation tilted. But life carried on. It's in the process of reunification that the reset becomes clear. Around 2050 BCE, a line of kings from Thebes, one of those provincial centres that had grown ambitious, gradually reasserts control over the south, then pushes north. By the time of Mentuhotep II, Egypt is, by most accounts, reunited. The Middle Kingdom begins. Crucially, they do not simply recreate Old Kingdom structures. They adjust them. In the early Middle Kingdom, royal inscriptions and administrative records suggest a deliberate clipping of provincial wings. Nomarchial positions are brought under tighter central oversight. Some become hereditary for a time, then seem to fade as the crown recentralizes. Royal officials are posted directly into the provinces, answerable to the court rather than to local families. The kings build new kinds of monuments, less overwhelmingly gigantic than the Giza pyramids, but integrated with temple complexes that strengthen state cults. They sponsor literature that praises the just ruler, the wise king who listens and provides, contrasting him with caricatures of chaos. Legitimacy, shattered and scattered during the first intermediate period, is being woven back together with administrative reform and narrative. We see a similar rhythm later. The end of the Middle Kingdom shades into a second intermediate period marked, among other things, by the rise of the Hyksos, a dynasty of Levantine origin in the eastern delta. Again, the long country fragments. Again, local rulers hold real power in their zones while still using the trappings of Egyptian kingship. Again, the central promise that one sovereign can secure the whole valley and its borders fails. And again, reunification comes from a provincial power base. The Theban kings of the early New Kingdom fight north, expel the Hyksos, then push Egyptian power far beyond previous limits into Syria and Nubia. With that expansion comes another round of administrative innovation, more elaborate taxation systems, standing armies, formalized provincial governorships in conquered lands. Each intermediate period, then, is not just a pause in the story. It is an X-ray. It shows us where loyalty actually sits when the centre's aura flickers. It reveals how much the state depends on being able to see and count what lies along its long arterial river, and what happens when local eyes and hands decide to prioritize their own. When the crisis passes and a new dynasty reunites the country, the repairs almost always involve two things: tinkering with how information and grain move between capital and provinces, and telling a new story about why this particular king, in this particular generation, once again embodies Maat. Underneath the familiar images of pyramids and temples, Egypt is quietly teaching us that even the most stable-looking civilizations pulse. They centralize, they decentralize, they recentralize. Legibility stretches outwards, frays, and is rewoven. In the next section, we'll leave the big river kingdoms and turn to a civilization that did something stranger. It let its great cities wind down without a single obvious conqueror or burning layer, and shifted its centre of gravity in ways that still puzzle archaeologists today. If Egypt is the civilization that pulses in and out of focus, but keeps telling one long story about itself, the Indus Valley, sometimes called Harappa after one of its key sites, is the civilization that keeps its secrets. We know it was there. We can walk its streets, trace the outlines of its houses, run our fingers over the little rectangular seals its merchants used. But we cannot yet read what they wrote. All through the core Indus region, from around 2600 to 1900 BCE, people carved a compact, standardized set of signs onto steatite seals, pottery, copper, even tools. The script is consistent enough to look like real writing, not just random marks. It appears in fixed positions. Some signs repeat, some only show up in certain combinations. And then, after a few hundred years, those signs thin out. They shrink, simplify, and eventually disappear from the archaeological record. Because the inscriptions are mostly short, 5, 6, maybe 10 characters, and we don't have a bilingual Rosetta Stone that pairs their language with something we understand. We are stuck. Scholars argue about whether the script encodes a full spoken language or some other kind of notation. There are cautious hints, statistical patterns, suggestive parallels with later South Asian languages, but no consensus. That undeciphered script is more than a technical problem. It's an interpretive wall. With Egypt, we can read royal decrees, land grants, hymns, instructions for scribes. With Mesopotamia, we have letters, lawsuits, warehouse lists. We can eavesdrop on people arguing, boasting, praying. With the Indus, we mostly have buildings, pottery, drains, weights, ornaments, and silence. So when we talk about what happened to this civilization, we need to hold our conclusions loosely. There are fewer must-have statements, more it looks like, it may be, this fits with. Even so, patterns emerge. If you were to stand on the walls of Mohenjo-Daro or Harappa at their height, you would see something remarkable and strangely familiar. Broad, straight streets laid out on a grid. Neighbourhoods of brick houses, often with private wells and bathrooms. Covered drains running under the streets, carrying wastewater away. The buildings are not all the same size. Some houses are larger, some smaller. But there is none of the ostentatious, towering palace architecture you find in Egypt or Mesopotamia. No giant royal tombs, no huge statues of kings. Instead, what jumps out is standardization. The bricks conform to a preferred ratio. The weights used in trade follow a regular series. The city plans, from site to site, rhyme with each other: citadel mounds, lower towns, carefully laid out streets. Even small objects like cubical weights and faience beads show a kind of quiet, disciplined conformity. Someone, or some network of someones, had enough authority, or enough shared norms, to make different communities build and measure things in very similar ways across hundreds of kilometers. And then, over the course of several centuries, all of that starts to loosen. In the northwestern parts of the Indus world, what is now Pakistan and Western India, the big, carefully planned cities see less upkeep. Drains silt up, public baths go out of use, new buildings go up in less regular patterns, sometimes encroaching on former streets. At some sites, the fine standardized weights associated with long-distance trade grow rarer. The famous square seals with animal motifs and script become smaller, cruder, or disappear. In some places, people start using different kinds of ceilings altogether. In the eastern and southern edges of the Indus cultural zone, something different happens. Settlements don't simply vanish, they shift. Population seems to move toward new regions, toward the upper Ganges plains, toward Gujarat and the coast. Smaller villages multiply where once a few very large cities dominated. And here again, the script fades. It's tempting, from a modern perspective, to look for the disaster. Where's the burning layer? Where are the toppled walls, the enemy weapons, the dramatic massacre pits? So far, they're mostly not there. There are individual destructions, as you'd expect in any long-lived region, but no clear, empire-wide conquest horizon like the fall of Nineveh or the sack of Rome. No single invading army we can point to and say, them. Instead, archaeologists see something more like what we might call an urban quieting. From about 1900 BCE onward, the number of large, formally planned cities declines. Some are partially abandoned, others shrink into much smaller, more modest settlements. Standardized artifacts associated with the earlier, highly integrated phase become rarer. Monumental public works are no longer maintained at the same scale. Yet people keep living in the region. Pottery keeps being made. Fields keep being worked. Life reconfigures instead of stopping. What could have nudged a civilization built on careful planning and standardized systems into this gentler kind of reset? Here we leave the firm ground of what we see and step into the cooler, hazier air of hypotheses. One line of evidence points to the rivers themselves. The Indus and its tributaries are not fixed pipes. They are living, shifting systems. Over centuries they meander, split, abandon old channels and carve new ones. Geological and remote sensing studies suggest that one major river, often associated with the later Vedic term Sarasvati, may have gradually dried or shifted course, reducing water flows to some heartland regions. If your big cities, your carefully gridded streets, your brick kilns and granaries are anchored to a particular river regime, a slow rerouting of the water is not a single catastrophe. It is a long, drawn-out stress. Wells go a little deeper each generation. Canals need more maintenance. Fields that were once consistently fed by floods become patchier, more reliant on direct rainfall. Which brings us to the monsoon. Paleoclimate studies, using lake sediments, cave formations, and ocean cores, suggest that the South Asian monsoon has varied over the last 5,000 years. There are periods when seasonal rains are heavier, and periods when they weaken or become more erratic. Some researchers see a correlation between a general weakening or increased variability in the monsoon around the late 3rd and early 2nd millennia BCE and the timing of Indus urban decline. Others warn that the dating is still fuzzy, that local conditions could differ from broader regional patterns. Still, it's easy to imagine what a slightly drier, less predictable monsoon would mean for a civilization built on big, organized settlements in river plains. Harvests more prone to failure, irrigation systems under strain, surplus grain, the lifeblood of complex trade and craft specialization harder to guarantee. Trade is the third suspect for centuries. Indus merchants seem to have been plugged into wider networks. Indus-style seals and goods appear in Mesopotamian cities, and Mesopotamian texts mention a place that may correspond to the Indus region, sending timber, precious stones, perhaps textiles. If changes in Mesopotamia, the Gulf or other intermediary zones shifted demand, routes or profitability, the finely tuned Indus system of weights, seals and standardized goods might have had to adapt. If adaptation lagged, the old business model, large, coordinated urban centres anchored in long-distance trade, could lose its edge. Notice how all of these potential drivers, river shifts, monsoon variability, trade realignments, are not single shocks. They are changes in the background conditions, in the invisible scaffolding that big centralized systems quietly rely on. From the outside, an Indus city might have looked like a model of order. Straight streets, standard bricks, drains, possibly some kind of civic authority capable of coordinating labour on a large scale. From the inside, that order depended on very specific assumptions, that water would arrive in roughly the expected ways, that harvests would be sufficient to support dense populations, that merchants could move goods reliably along familiar routes, that the people who built and maintained drains and wells could be fed and organised. If those assumptions eroded, the legibility of the system, its ability to see, count and direct, would also erode. Imagine being one of the people who, whatever their official title, had to make the city work. Your records, however they were kept, tell you how much grain to expect, how many bricks can be fired, how many workers can be mobilised for maintaining the drains after the rains. Your measures and weights are calibrated to a certain volume of trade. Then, across a lifetime or two, your numbers start lying. A canal that once watered 3 fields now struggles to feed 2. Monsoon rains are strong one year, weak the next. A neighbouring city you've always dealt with becomes harder to reach as a river channels away. Merchants from the west arrive less often, or pay less for your goods. The system is less predictable, and your tools for making it legible, standard weights, scripted seals, city-wide plans are tuned to a different reality. At that point, people do what they've always done. They adapt, but they adapt locally. Households dig their own wells instead of relying on big communal ones. Neighbourhoods patch drains to serve just their lane rather than the whole quarter. Small villages form closer to reliable water sources, even if that means being farther from the old city. In the archaeological record, this looks like fragmentation of standardization. Bricks shift from the old preferred ratio to a variety of local sizes. Seals disappear. Simple clay tokens or nothing at all take their place. The tight grid of a planned city softens into a more organic, irregular settlement. From the perspective of the old integrated Indus urbanism, this is a loss of legibility and central coordination. The system that once could see across a region through its standard weights and seals can no longer do so. From the perspective of families living through it, it may have felt like something else, moving closer to the well that still flows, planting in the field that still gets rain, trusting the nearby headman more than a distant authority whose ability to provide has become uncertain. What replaces the old form is not a void, but a different pattern of life. In the so-called late Harappan and post-Harappan phases, people in the northwest and on the plains continue making pottery and tools, but with more regional styles. In Gujarat and along the coast, smaller port towns and villages tap into maritime routes that do not require a huge inland bureaucracy. In the upper Ganges, new settlement patterns appear that will, much later, feed into different cultural and political formations. the great tidy grid of Mohenjo-Daro is no longer the dominant template. Instead, we see many smaller, more varied nodes, each with its own way of doing things, its own networks. If we apply our pattern test here, the Indus civilization becomes a kind of mirror held up to Egypt and Mesopotamia. We don't see a dramatic narrative of kings overreaching, of empires crumbling under the weight of their own armies. We see a quiet thinning out of the very things that make a society legible to itself: shared measures, shared writing, shared urban layouts. When water and trade, the two main arteries of that legibility, shift, the big coordinated project gently unwinds. Authority, such as it was, likely retreats from the scale of entire river basins to the scale of towns and villages. In that sense, the Indus collapse may be less like a building falling down and more like a fog lifting. What looked like a single unified civilization resolves into many smaller communities, each adjusting to its own microclimate, its own stretch of riverbank, its own trading coastline. And like Egypt's intermediate periods, this is not an ending so much as a reorganization. The technologies, crops, and habits of Indus life don't vanish. They seep forward into later cultures. Some crop choices, town layouts, and craft traditions in South Asia may trace thin, almost invisible lines back to those quieted cities. But the particular experiment of large, standardized, script-using Indus urbanism does not reassemble itself in the same way. In the next section, we'll watch a different civilization, the classic Maya, play out another version of this pattern, where cities thin and scatter not under a single invading army, but under the weight of shifting climate, prestige competition, and the limits of how far a ruling class can stretch its stories of why they deserve to rule. If you shifted now from the gridded streets of Mohenjo-Daro to the forested lowlands of what is now Guatemala, Belize, and parts of Mexico and Honduras around, say, 700 CE, the scene would at first feel utterly different. Dense jungle, steep limestone ridges, no rivers like the Nile or Indus threading visibly through the landscape, and rising out of that greenery, tall stepped pyramids, palace complexes stacked on artificial terraces, broad plazas framed by carved stone monuments. This is the world of the classic Maya, roughly from 250 to 900 CE. Not a single empire, but a mosaic of city-states. Tikal, Calakmul, Copan, Palenque, Karakol, and dozens more. Each with its own dynasty, its own emblem glyph, its own ancestral stories. Unlike the Indus, the Maya left us long texts we can partially read. Their script is largely deciphered. On their stelae and stairways, kings and queens recorded accessions, wars, alliances, rituals, and calculated cycles of time. That legibility for us comes with a twist. We see the world mostly through elite eyes. In those texts and in the archaeology, a particular pattern stands out. Political authority among the classic Maya was deeply tied to lineage and ritual performance. A ruler was not just a military leader. He, and sometimes she, was a divine intermediary, expected to literally feed the gods with blood, incense offerings, and properly timed ceremonies. Dynastic legitimacy was performed in stone. New rulers often commemorated their accessions with stelae, tall slabs covered in hieroglyphs and elaborate portraits. Building projects surged under particular kings. A successful reign might be marked by the construction of a new pyramid, a renovated palace, a ball court, a hieroglyphic stair. Prestige was cumulative and competitive. City-states formed alliances and fought wars, capturing each other's nobles and sometimes enthroning puppet rulers in rival courts. Wars were recorded not only as territorial grabs, but as ritual events, star wars timed to astronomical phenomena, decapitations of enemy lords carved in painful detail. All of this had a cost. Building a pyramid or raising a stela does not produce food. It consumes labour and materials. Someone has to quarry limestone, haul it, shape it, stack it. Someone has to carve the glyphs, plaster and paint the structures, prepare the feasting that celebrates dedication ceremonies. That someone is not the royal family. It is farmers and craftspeople mobilized through obligations, tribute, corvée labour. We can see the scale of this extraction in the built environment itself. At some sites, enormous volumes of stone were moved over short periods. Settlements around major centres show evidence of terraced agriculture and intensive land use, likely feeding both daily needs and periodic surges of construction and ritual demand. For a while, this system worked. From around 600 to 750 CE, many classic Maya cities experienced what some scholars call a late classic florescence. Populations grew, monument programs intensified, carved dates cluster in these centuries. It looks on the surface like a high point. Underneath that peak, the environmental context was shifting. The Maya lowlands depend heavily on seasonal rainfall. There are rivers in some regions, and natural depressions called bajos and karstic sinkholes that can hold water. But there is nothing equivalent to a snow-fed Nile flood. To survive the long dry season, Maya communities relied on reservoirs, canals, terracing, forest management, and careful timing of planting and harvest. Paleoclimate studies using lake sediments, cave formations, stalagmites, and marine cores from nearby coasts suggest that between about 800 and 1000 CE, Central America experienced periods of reduced rainfall and greater variability. Some cores show layers consistent with repeated droughts, not a single catastrophic year, but clusters of drier decades. Not everyone agrees on the exact timing or severity at every locality. Dates have margins of error, and local microclimates could differ. But there is a broad pattern. Just as many classic centres are hitting their stride in monument building, the climate backdrop becomes more fickle. Imagine what that feels like on the ground. You are a maize farmer living in the hinterland of a great city. You already give a portion of your harvest as tribute. You already send a son or a brother for weeks at a time to help with a temple renovation or a new causeway. The ruler has obligations too, to keep the calendar, to perform bloodletting rituals, to host feasts, to make rain and fertility align. Then the rains start coming a little later, or they arrive in violent storms that erode your fields instead of gentle, soaking showers. A reservoir that used to carry your community through April is muddy and low by February. You cope, plant different varieties, clear new patches, rework terraces. Meanwhile, in the city, royal rivals are watching each other closely. A neighbouring dynasty builds a taller temple. Your king must respond. A rival wins a victory and captures an important lord. Your king needs to stage an impressive ceremony to reaffirm his own power. Monument counts show that in some regions, as conditions become more stressed, the rate of stellar erection and building continues or even spikes. From the perspective of elite competition, this makes sense. When the world becomes uncertain, doubling down on visible displays of legitimacy is a natural response. From the perspective of resilience, it is dangerous. Labour and surplus that might have gone into diversifying water storage, experimenting with drought-resistant crops, or maintaining rural terraces can instead be drawn into prestige projects and ritual cycles. Archaeologists working at various sites have found evidence of intensifying agriculture. More fields pushed into marginal zones, more sediment washed into bajos, alongside continued building campaigns. The pattern we saw in Egypt and the Indus begins to reappear, but with a Maya accent. As stress accumulates, the tools of legibility and rule, monuments, calendars, ritual obligations are leaned on harder. Extraction increases. The system's ability to flex is quietly eroded. At some sites there are hints that internal conflict compounded these pressures. Defensive walls appear or are strengthened, royal lineages splinter. Monuments mention wars more frequently. Elite factions may have turned on each other, seeking advantage when cooperation was most needed. In this context, trust becomes fragile. If you are a commoner watching your reservoir shrink, your children go hungry, and your obligations to the centre grow, the story that the king's rituals keep the cosmos in balance starts to ring hollow. If a neighbouring polity seems to be doing slightly better, or if lands to the west or north offer more reliable rainfall, the invisible calculus of loyalty can shift. Archaeologically, from about 800 to 900 CE, many classic Maya centres show signs of strain and then thinning. Monument erection slows, then stops. Royal palaces go unmaintained. Some buildings are hastily repurposed, others are abandoned mid-construction. In some cases there is evidence of violence or burning, in others just quiet neglect. At the same time, populations do not vanish from the landscape. Settlement surveys suggest that people move. They disperse into smaller communities, shift toward regions with more reliable water or better soils, or reorient around different kinds of centres. In the northern Yucatan, for example, cities like Chichen Itza rise as many southern lowland centres decline. The collapse of the classic Maya is thus less a disappearance, and more a political reset. Dynastic capitals that had concentrated ritual, warfare and monumental display lose their pull. The centres of gravity in the Maya world move, and the forms of organisation change. Linguistically and culturally, Maya people continue right through the so-called collapse and into the post-classic period, when new kinds of states and confederations form, and much later into contact with the Spanish. Sacred texts like parts of the Popol Vuh preserve older mythic frameworks reshaped under new regimes. Agricultural practices, calendar knowledge, and local ritual traditions persist in altered forms. Seen through our recurring pattern, the classic Maya illustrate another variation on the same underlying theme. A network of city-states held together by shared ideas about sacred kingship and timed rituals becomes ever more tightly bound to displays of prestige. As environmental variability increases, the ruling class responds by extracting more to maintain its competitive status and cosmological role, rather than by collectively downgrading competition and investing in shared adaptation. When that choice erodes the system's resilience past a certain point, people begin to vote with their feet. They walk away from some ceremonial centres and toward places where subsistence feels more secure and obligations more bearable. Trust in the old stories of why these particular lineages deserve to rule breaks, not all at once, but in 1,000 small practical decisions. The result is not the end of Maya civilization, but the end of one version of it, the classic constellation of dynastic capitals scattered through the southern lowlands. What follows is a reorganization into new hubs, new alliances, new ways of being Maya. In the next section, we'll turn to a civilization whose fall has long been used as a warning tale in the West, Rome. There too, we'll look past the familiar images of barbarian invasions to trace how complexity, fiscal strain, and fragile trust made the Western Empire less able to absorb the shocks that were always coming. If you were to drift now from the forests of the Maya lowlands to the shores of the Mediterranean around, say 200 CE, the feel of the world would change again. Stone roads radiating out from a central city like veins from a heart. Granaries at ports stacked with African and Egyptian grain. Soldiers marching in standardized gear, answering to written orders stamped with imperial seals. Courthouses where governors hear petitions under the shadow of written codes and imperial rescripts. This is Rome in the High Empire. Not just a city, but a machine of logistics. The Romans were obsessed with making the world legible and traversable to themselves. They built roads that endured for millennia, engineered aqueducts that carried water over long distances, and developed a postal system able to move messages, orders, and tax data across thousands of kilometers. The Mediterranean became, in their phrase, our sea, tied together by scheduled grain fleets feeding the city of Rome and other major hubs. Underneath the marble and rhetoric, it worked like a giant supply network. Provinces rich in grain, like Egypt and North Africa, were wired into shipping routes that had to function predictably year after year. Garrisons along the frontiers depended on those same flows. Tax in kind, requisitioned animals, coin minted in distant workshops. Law, too, was part of the logistics. Standardized legal forms, precedents, and concepts like Roman citizenship circulated across the empire. Local disputes could be appealed up the chain. Governors rotated through posts according to rules. Edicts were archived. This made the empire feel, to many within it, like a single legal space. That kind of system is powerful. It is also expensive. Armies had to be paid. Forts had to be built and maintained. Roads, bridges, ports, and bureaucracies all had ongoing costs. Emperors distributed donatives to troops to secure loyalty. Urban populations in key cities expected, and often received, annual grain distributions or heavily subsidized bread. For a while, conquest helped pay the bills. New provinces meant war plunder, new tax bases, and fresh streams of slaves. But an empire cannot expand forever. By the 2nd century CE, Roman military fronts had mostly stabilized. The easy targets were gone. At the same time, the very success of Roman administration created more administrative work. More records, more courts, more officials, more layers. Scholars sometimes talk about this as complexity. A growing web of interdependent offices and obligations that can be remarkably effective when things go well, but that carries an invisible maintenance cost. We can see the strain in their money. In the early empire, Rome minted coins with a relatively stable silver content. Over the 3rd century CE, that changes. The silver denarius, once trustworthy, is repeatedly debased, less silver, more base metal, often covered with a thin silvery wash. Documentary sources from the period complain about rising prices. Hoards of coins show rapid shifts in composition. Historians debate how exactly this played out on the ground. Inflation is hard to measure from 2,000 years away, but the pattern is clear enough. As military and administrative expenses rose, emperors searching for revenue leaned more heavily on the mint. Coinage, the medium through which taxes were paid and soldiers were compensated, became less reliable. Alongside this fiscal strain came a cascade of political shocks. From 235 to 284 CE, the empire endured what is sometimes called the crisis of the 3rd century. Emperors rose and fell in dizzying succession, often killed by their own troops. Breakaway regimes formed in Gaul and the East. Plagues, possibly smallpox or measles, swept through. Frontier pressures intensified. Goths across the Danube, Persians in the east, various groups testing the Rhine and Danube limes. It is tempting to tell a simple story here. Barbarian invasions bring down a decadent empire. But the evidence pushes us towards something more entangled. Border peoples had always been part of Rome's world, as trading partners, mercenaries, and sometimes enemies. Roman policy often involved recruiting non-Roman groups into the army, granting them land in return for service, and using one group to balance another. This could work quite well. It also meant that what we later call invasions can, up close, look like negotiated settlements that became harder to manage as central capacity thinned. Inside the empire, the same pattern of legibility and extraction we have been tracing shows up again in Roman form. To tax an empire, you need to be able to see it. The Romans developed censuses and tax registers that enumerated land, people, and productive capacity. Provincial communities were required to record who owned what, who owed what, and who was responsible when those obligations were not met. Legal texts from the later empire show a proliferation of categories, different statuses of persons, different types of land, different exemptions and burdens. When imperial control was strong, this legibility translated into predictable obligations. A landowner might grumble about taxes, but he could often count on roads being maintained, courts hearing cases, and armies showing up when the frontier flared. When control weakened, something else happened. In times of crisis, emperors tended to double down on what they could still measure. Tax quotas were raised or enforced more harshly on those easiest to reach: landed elites, urban guilds, local councils. Laws from the late empire repeatedly chastised decurions, the local councillors responsible for collecting taxes, for trying to flee their posts or hide assets. That recurrence suggests a chronic problem. The people tasked with upholding the system were losing faith that it would protect them. As enforcement became patchier, those with means began to hedge. If you were a local elite in Gaul or Spain in the 4th or 5th century, you might still enjoy Roman education, participate in Roman law, and see yourself as part of a Roman world. But you would also be watching the horizon. If a powerful general, a regional strongman, or a migrating group settled nearby and offered a different bargain, military protection in exchange for land, for example, you might consider it. We glimpse this in legal attempts to forbid private patronage arrangements, where small landholders placed themselves under the protection of great magnates, and in accounts of Roman aristocrats negotiating with Gothic or Frankish leaders rather than solely with imperial officials. The invisible calculus of loyalty was shifting from a distant centre to nearer power brokers. The pattern is familiar now. As the empire's fiscal and administrative machinery strained, and as border pressures mounted, Rome's capacity to provide the services that had justified its extraction, security, predictable law, functioning logistics, eroded in places. When the promises at the core of the imperial bargain begin to fail, trust follows. This does not mean that everything collapsed at once. Even in the 5th century, when iconic events like the sack of Rome in 410 or the deposition of the last Western emperor in 476 occur, many aspects of life continue with surprising continuity. Taxes are still assessed in some regions. Roman law codes are copied and used. Local aristocrats maintain villas, patronage networks, and literary culture. What changes, gradually and unevenly, is who stands at the top of the pyramid and how the basic bargain is structured. In the western provinces, groups like the Visigoths, Ostrogoths, Vandals, and Franks establish what we now call successor kingdoms. They often adopt Roman titles, employ Roman bureaucrats, and issue laws in a Roman style. The land-holding elites who had once anchored imperial administration increasingly tie their fortunes to these new rulers. Meanwhile, one Roman institution weaves through the whole transition: the Christian Church. By the time political control in the West fragments, the Church has a network of bishops, councils, and monasteries that spans many former provincial boundaries. Bishops become key mediators between local communities, new kings, and distant ideals of Roman order. They keep records, arbitrate disputes, manage charitable distributions, and sometimes negotiate with armed forces. In some ways, the Church inherits part of Rome's legibility function. Parish registers, ecclesiastical courts, and canon law offer new avenues through which people and obligations can be seen and managed. In exchange, a different kind of bargain emerges: loyalty and land grants to kings and monasteries in return for protection, salvation narratives, and social stability. From a distance, this looks like collapse. The Roman Empire in the West gone, replaced by a patchwork of barbarian realms. Up close, it looks more like a reset of complexity. The high-cost, high-integration machine of imperial Rome gives way to smaller, less centralized polities. Some of the old roads, aqueducts, and cities fall into disrepair. Others persist. Extraction does not disappear, but it is reframed, tied to local lords, military retinues, and ecclesiastical tithes, rather than to distant emperors and legions. The pattern we have been following runs through it all. a system that made the world legible enough to extract from at scale, and strong enough for a time to uphold the bargain of security and law, gradually found its costs outpacing its resilience. As fiscal strain grew and enforcement thinned, trust fractured sideways toward regional power brokers and enduring institutions like the Church. What emerged on the other side was not a void, but a new configuration of authority, obligation, and belief. A different civilization in some respects built atop the old one's bones. In our next stop, we'll travel east, to a place where that cycle of centralization, strain, and reset was observed, named, and woven into official ideology itself, imperial China and the long story of the mandate of heaven. If you drift now east across steppes and mountains, you arrive in a world that tried to make sense of resets not just as accidents but as law. Imperial China did something unusual in world history. It didn't just endure repeated rises and falls of dynasties, it developed a story about why this kept happening, and folded that story into official doctrine. Later historians call it the dynastic cycle. In the most simplified telling, it goes like this. A new dynasty rises. Usually after chaos, a strong leader unifies warring states, promises order, cuts taxes, opens the granaries, repairs the canals. This founding generation is remembered as frugal, energetic, close to the land. The mandate of heaven, the right to rule, is said to be theirs. Over time, prosperity grows, population rises, cities expand, trade thickens. The state builds more roads, more dikes, more granaries. It refines its exam systems, its law codes, its tax registers. The centre's reach becomes impressive. Then, slowly strain. Corruption seeps in. Local magistrates skim. Court factions squabble. Tax demands rise to fund palaces or wars. Floods, droughts, or plagues hit. Peasants can't pay. Officials falsify reports. Banditry spreads. Finally, rebellions. Armies once loyal to the dynasty turn. A rival claimant proclaims that the old house has lost heaven's mandate. After war and devastation, a new dynasty takes power, denounces its predecessor as decadent and cruel, resets some policies, and the story starts again. That's the textbook version. Reality, as always, is messier. But the pattern is rooted in some very concrete tools and pressures. Chinese imperial states, especially from the Han dynasty onward, developed a sophisticated set of instruments to see and shape their society. Taxation, first. Early systems often used labour and grain in kind. Households were registered by name, age and landholding in yellow registers and other census documents. These weren't just lists, they were the skeleton of the fiscal state. To assign quotas, conscript soldiers, and levy corvée labour, you needed to know who lived where and what they could produce. Corvée labour itself was a major pillar. Peasants owed a set number of days each year to work on state projects, roads, city walls, irrigation works, flood control dikes. This was how immense infrastructure got built without a standing industrial workforce. The price was time taken from fields and families. Over the centuries, these obligations were repeatedly recalibrated. Some dynasties tried to commute corvée into money taxes. Others, especially after wars and depopulation, relaxed demands to lure people back onto registered land. Every change created winners and losers, and every reform added another layer of regulation. Then there were the examinations by the Tang and Song dynasties, and especially under the later imperial system, the civil service exams became the main route into officialdom. In theory, any literate male could study the classics, sit the multi-stage exams, and earn rank. In practice, success favoured those with time, tutors, and connections. Still, the exam system did something remarkable. It created a vast, partially standardised elite, schooled in the same Confucian texts and ideals, dispersed across the empire. These officials were the eyes and hands of the dynasty. They kept tax rolls, judged lawsuits, supervised dike repairs, inspected granaries, petitioned the throne. Their memorials and reports made far-flung provinces legible to the court. Granaries were one of the most concrete expressions of this capacity. Successive dynasties invested heavily in state grain storage. In good years, the government collected surplus grain as tax or purchase and stored it in local and regional granaries. In bad years, crop failure, locusts, unseasonal frosts, these stores could be released, sold below market price, loaned to peasants to be repaid after the next harvest, or distributed as outright relief. The famous, ever-normal granaries of the Qing, for example, aimed to smooth both famine and price swings. In some periods they worked impressively well. Records show local officials calculating how much to release to stabilize markets without exhausting reserves. When the system functioned, it embodied the Confucian ideal of benevolent rule, the state as guardian of the people's basic subsistence. Infrastructure tied into this. Canal systems like the Grand Canal, dike networks along the Yellow River, and irrigation works in the south were not just engineering marvels, they were the arteries through which grain, tax, and information flowed. Maintaining them required ongoing inputs, labour crews, materials, skilled supervisors who understood local conditions. When these arteries were in good repair, moving grain from surplus regions to deficit ones was possible. When they silted up or broke, local disasters could no longer be cushioned. Against this apparatus stood the shocks, floods on the Yellow River that shifted its course and drowned fields. Droughts that withered crops across multiple provinces. Epidemics that thinned both taxpayers and soldiers. Pressures along the northern and western frontiers from steppe confederations that were themselves responding to climate or political changes. Inside the court, factionalism waxed and waned. Scholar officials argued over tax policy, foreign relations and reforms. Eunuchs or palace cliques sometimes dominated emperors. Individual reigns could be marked by unusual diligence at the top, or by withdrawal and delegation. The exact combination varied with era. The late Eastern Han, the end of the Tang, the fall of the Yuan, the Ming-Qing transition. Each had its own mix of provincial militarization, court intrigue, environmental stress, and fiscal strain. But through them all, one pattern stands out. The more finely the state tried to see, tax and regulate its subjects, the more openings there were for things to go wrong internally. Legibility. The ability of the centre to measure land, people, and production was double-edged. Detailed registers allowed officials to apportion tax and corvée in ways that could feel fair when done by conscientious magistrates. They also created opportunities for manipulation. Local elites might bribe clerks to underreport their holdings. Officials might inflate quotas on paper while losing part of the collection. Peasants experienced this not as an abstract flaw in a system, but as concrete demands: extra grain, extra labour days, new levies to fund frontier garrisons or repair a canal they might never see. In good years these burdens could be bore. In years of bad harvests they could become impossible. Imperial rhetoric insisted that the ruler's duty was to lighten these loads in times of distress. Edicts proclaiming tax remissions and relief were part of the moral theatre of power. When local suffering was bad and state response slow or absent, the dissonance was glaring. This is where the mandate of heaven mattered. Unlike Rome, where legitimacy was often framed through law, tradition, and military success, Chinese political thought developed an explicit language tying moral virtue, natural order, and political authority together. If the emperor ruled justly, respected the people, and listened to good advice, heaven would bless the realm with stability and timely seasons. If he or his court became corrupt, greedy, or cruel, heaven would send warnings, strange omens, earthquakes, floods, droughts. If those warnings went unheeded, heaven could withdraw its mandate and bestow it upon another. This was not just elite philosophy. Rebels invoked it. Pamphlets and proclamations during uprisings often declared that disasters proved the dynasty had lost the mandate. Leaders claimed prophetic dreams, signs in the sky, or popular slogans as proof that they were heaven's chosen replacements. In that sense, trust fracture in imperial China often took the form of a narrative break. As long as the lived experience of peasants and local gentry could be squared with the story, that the ruler was, on balance, keeping order, relieving famine, maintaining the granaries and canals, the mandate felt intact, even through hardship. When the gap became too wide, granaries locked while people starved, conscription escalating while bandits roamed, the story stopped making sense. Rebellion was one way that mismatch expressed itself. Sometimes through organized religious groups, sometimes through military strongmen, sometimes through peasant coalitions that began as tax resistance and grew. These uprisings could be brutally suppressed. But over the long run, when enough regions slipped out of control, when rival regimes held major cities and claimed their own mandates, the old dynasty's legitimacy unravelled. What followed, often after years or decades of fragmentation, was usually reunification. A new house rose, Qin replaced Zhou, Han replaced Qin, Sui, and then Tang reunified after centuries of division. Song followed 5 dynasties, Ming after Yuan, Qing after Ming. Each did something recognizably similar at the start. They cut some taxes, at least on paper. They proclaimed amnesties. They redistributed land or adjusted tenancy rights, often in favour of smallholders, to rebuild the tax base. They repaired canals and dikes. They reformed examinations or officials' evaluation systems. They ordered new land surveys and household registrations to reset the state's view of the countryside. And they rewrote history. Official dynastic histories, compiled by scholars under the new regime, told the story of the previous dynasty's rise, virtue, gradual corruption, and final loss of the mandate. Disasters were retroactively read as omens. Rebellions were cast as either righteous beginnings of the new order or as dangerous chaos rightly suppressed. The new dynasty was framed as both a return to ancient virtue and an innovation tailored to current needs. These resets did not erase everything. Local lineages, irrigation practices, informal norms of village self-governance, and regional cultures often persisted across dynastic lines. But at the scale of statecraft, each cycle recalibrated the balance between visibility, extraction, and promise. If the empire could see you clearly, your fields, your sons, your stores of grain, it could tax and mobilize you. If in return it delivered famine relief, flood control, and a sense that heaven's order still held, the bargain could feel acceptable. When it did not, the same clarity turned into a map for resistance. Across 2 millennia, China turned this recurring pattern into a story about how the world works. A story that made resets feel less like breakdowns and more like cosmic corrections. As we move on, we'll step from this long, internally theorized cycle to a different kind of reset, one where water, not grain, sits at the center of an empire's legibility and fragility, the rise and quieting of Angkor. If you let your mind drift south and west now, down out of the high plateaus of China, across forests and river deltas, you arrive in a different kind of hydraulic world. Here, the central problem wasn't moving grain over thousands of kilometers. It was catching water that came all at once, in a few months of monsoon, and stretching it across the long, thirsty, dry season. This was the world of Angkor, the heartland of the Khmer Empire, in what is now Cambodia. For several centuries, roughly from the 9th to the 15th, this landscape held one of the largest low-density cities on Earth. A web of embankments, moats, straight roads, rice fields and reservoirs stitched together around temple mountains like Angkor Wat and the Bayon. From the ground, it would have felt like endless countryside punctuated by stone. From the air, something no one then could see, it was an engineered water machine. The basic problem was simple and severe. The region has a marked wet season and dry season. From about May to October, heavy rains. Rivers swell, the great Tonle Sap Lake expands, floods spread across low-lying land. Then for months almost nothing, dust, heat, cracked earth. Rice, wet rice. The staple of the Khmer needs water at the right times, in the right amounts. Too little, the crop fails. Too much at the wrong moment, the plants drown. So Khmer rulers and engineers built a system to even that out. They dug canals, wide and straight, that linked the city to the floodplains and to the Tonle Sap. They raised earthen embankments and dug moats. Most spectacularly, they constructed barrage, huge rectangular reservoirs, some measuring kilometres on a side, held in place by walls of compacted earth. Archaeological surveys and LiDAR imaging over the last few decades have revealed just how dense and integrated this system was. Grids of embanked fields, spillways and weirs to control flow. Channels that seem to have been periodically rerouted and rebuilt as new temples went up, and old ones declined. The purpose of all this wasn't ornamental. It was hydraulic, to store and redirect monsoon waters, to irrigate rice over extended areas, to protect the city from floods, and possibly to this day still debated, to flush and cleanse the urban moats and ponds. When it worked, the result was abundance. One of the standard estimates is that the Angkorian core could support hundreds of thousands of people, perhaps more, on the basis of its rice fields. Multiple harvests were possible in some zones. Surplus grain fed artisans, temple workers, soldiers and court officials. It allowed monumental building on a scale that still leaves visitors stunned. But infrastructure, especially hydraulic infrastructure, carries a particular double edge. The more successful your system at turning seasonal chaos into predictable flows, the more your society organizes itself around that predictability. Planting calendars, labor obligations, temple rituals, taxation, they all synchronize to the cycle of managed water, not just natural rain. That brings prosperity. It also creates dependency. Fields tied into a carefully levelled canal network don't easily switch back to purely rain-fed agriculture. Villages located to take advantage of reservoir outlets can't just slide a few kilometres away if embankments fail. People whose status and security depend on temple offices, ritual calendars, and central rice storage are bound in multiple ways to the system that feeds them. In that sense, Angkor's canals and barrage were not just engineering works. They were commitments. Once the Khmer state dug them, expanded them, and wove its social and religious life through them, it was locked into maintaining them. And maintenance is never glamorous. Canals silt up, embankments slump, tree roots slowly pry apart carefully packed earth, weirs and gates built from laterite and sandstone wear under the constant scouring of water. Insects bore, grasses invade, small breaches become big ones. Keeping a water city functioning requires constant low-level attention, dredging, patrolling, rebuilding after every exceptional flood, coordinating upstream and downstream users. It is, in effect, an endless tax on time and labour. We have hints from inscriptions and temple reliefs of how the Khmer state tried to organise this. Royal inscriptions speak of kings founding or repairing barrage, dedicating them to Hindu or later Buddhist deities. They often list the villages obligated to serve a particular temple, the fields whose produce was dedicated as temple income, the specialists, priests, dancers, scribes, artisans, attached to these foundations. This was a temple economy, but also an administrative map. To fund maintenance, the state didn't simply levy anonymous taxes. It folded hydraulic works into religious legitimacy. A king who built a new barai was not only an engineer, he was a merit maker, a cosmic stabilizer. The waterworks were offerings to gods as much as tools of rice cultivation. This sacralization made the system visible and intelligible to both elites and villagers. Your village might be assigned to a temple whose icon was associated with a royal ancestor. Your rice fields might be listed in carved stone as belonging to that temple, with fixed proportions of harvest going to its granaries. Modern historians and archaeologists see in these lists a kind of khmer legibility. The centre recorded who owed what, who maintained which embankment, whose labour serviced which foundation. It was not a census in the Chinese sense, but it was still a way of making people and land readable, countable, and therefore extractable. The same system that channeled water also channeled labour. Corvée, the obligation to work for the state or temple for set periods, likely supplied the human power to dredge canals and raise reservoir walls. Just as in China, these obligations could feel acceptable when harvests were good and water predictably arrived. They were part of the cosmic bargain. The king guarantees order and fertility. The people provide labour and offerings. So what happens when the water becomes less predictable? From tree rings, lake cores, and other paleoclimate proxies, researchers now argue that the last centuries of Angkor's prominence saw episodes of significant climate variability, periods of prolonged drought punctuated by years of intense monsoon storms. The evidence is not perfect, and interpretations differ, but one scenario goes like this. In drought years, flows along the canal network would have dropped. Reservoirs would have shrunk, exposing muddy margins, concentrating pollutants, creating problems for both irrigation and drinking water. Rice yields would fall. The state, to keep temples and officials supplied, might have had to lean harder on local producers. Then, in years of unusually heavy rain, the same infrastructure could become a conduit for damage. Embankments overtopped and eroded, canal banks collapsed, carefully graded fields were scoured. Instead of buffering variability, the system could amplify it. Water rushing through artificial channels with a violent natural rivers might have diffused across broader floodplains. Each extreme would demand more maintenance, more labour. The machine that had made Angkor rich would begin to eat more of its own output just to stay functional. If at the same time external trade opportunities were shifting, maritime routes through the Gulf of Thailand and along the Vietnamese coast growing more important relative to inland networks around the Tonle Sap, the economic logic of pouring endless labour into interior waterworks might have weakened. The temple economy's legibility would now feel less like cosmic order and more like a net. You and your neighbours might see embankments crumbling, canals choked, but still be expected to deliver rice quotas to a distant temple whose rituals no longer seem to bring the rains. You might hear of ports downstream where traders exchange forest products, ceramics, and rice for imported goods and prestige items, independent of the Angkorian core. Trust doesn't break all at once, it thins. Villages that can still count on local ponds and wells or that have access to new trade nodes might quietly redirect their energy. Corvée obligations might be evaded, records allowed to go out of date, local strongmen stepping into the gap, as the central court struggles to keep up with crumbling embankments and factional disputes. Archaeologically, the fall of Angkor is not a single catastrophe. There is no one date when the city burns and empties forever. Instead, there are signs of gradual depopulation of some zones, the reoccupation or intensification of others, and the rise of new political centres downstream, closer to maritime trade. One later capital at Phnom Penh sits near the junction of the Mekong and Tonle Sap rivers, better positioned for riverine and seagoing commerce. The court seems to pivot over time toward these more promising nodes, even as Angkor itself fades as the preeminent centre. If you zoom out, the pattern looks familiar. A state builds a powerful infrastructure to tame a key element of its environment. In China, canals and granaries to smooth grain flows. In Angkor, reservoirs and canals to manage water for rice. That infrastructure underwrites both abundance and the state's own legibility and extraction. Over time, maintenance burdens rise. Environmental variability, external trade shifts, and internal strains all accumulate. When the infrastructure begins to fail at the very moments it is most needed, the moral and practical basis of trust erodes. People do not vanish. They recenter around more reliable water sources, more accessible markets, more responsive authorities. The old capital becomes, eventually, ruins in the forest, wrapped in myth. Angkor's reset was not the end of the Khmer people. It was a reconfiguration from an inland hydraulic empire to smaller, more maritime-oriented polities. And it sets up a quiet question. If a civilization can build a city sized to a monsoon and then, over centuries, watch its own waterworks become a source of fragility, what happens when the shocks are not just regional? When the infrastructure tying worlds together is global trade winds, ocean routes, and invisible microbes? To see that, we step into a very different kind of reset, one where the agents of change ride ships, not monsoons, and the biggest collapse is in population, not palaces. Follow that thought downstream and you arrive in a world that looks, on the surface, much more familiar. Stone churches instead of temple mountains, walled towns instead of barrets, lords, peasants, kings and bishops strung across a checkerboard of fields, forests and rivers. Late medieval Europe. By the 13th and early 14th centuries, much of Western Europe had stabilized into a rough pattern. Feudal relationships had been formalized. Monarchies were consolidating. Towns were growing, guilds were forming, universities were emerging. Fields were cleared, mills and wine presses were turning, monasteries kept records and prayers. It was not yet the world of nation-states and factories, but it was moving in that direction. Like Angkor, it was a landscape knit together by obligations. If you were a peasant in, say, northern France or England around 1300, your life was measured in dues. Labour days on the Lord's demesne, rents in grain or coin, tithes to the parish church, fees at the mill, the oven, the wine press. Protection, justice and salvation in exchange for obedience, service and surplus. Kings claimed overlordship. Nobles claimed rights over their men. Bishops and abbots claimed the souls and offerings of the faithful. The church, with its Latin, its sacraments and its courts, was the spine running through it all. Then, quite suddenly, something invisible tore through that order. In the late 1340s, a new disease arrived from the east, carried along trade routes that linked the Black Sea to Mediterranean ports, then inland along riverways and roads. Today, we call it the Black Death. Most historians associate it with plague caused by Yersinia pestis, though the exact mix of pathogens and transmission routes is still debated. What is not debated is the scale of mortality. In wave after wave across a few years, somewhere between a third and a half of Europe's population may have died. In some towns, contemporary chroniclers claim 9 of 10 people vanished. Numbers in the sources are often exaggerated, but the demographic crater is visible in later tax records, manorial accounts, and abandoned villages. Imagine Angkor's hydraulic system suddenly losing half its workers. Now imagine that, not as a slow erosion over centuries, but as a sharp cut over a few harvests. Fields lay untilled. Livestock wandered. Skilled artisans, blacksmiths, millers, weavers died alongside their neighbours. Priests and monks, who administered to the sick, died in disproportionate numbers. Entire lineages blinked out. Villages disappeared from the rolls. It was not a collapse of walls and palaces. It was a collapse of people, and that makes the Black Death a different kind of reset. The castles still stood. The churches still stood. King's chancelleries still issued charters, but the human foundation beneath those institutions was suddenly, brutally, thinner. In economic terms, the ratio between land and labour flipped. Before the plague, in many regions, there were more people than good land. That meant intense competition for plots, downward pressure on wages, and a strong hand for landlords. Feudal dues could be harsh because there were always more peasants to fill the gaps. After the plague, there was suddenly more land than people. Vacant holdings, unclaimed meadows, manors struggling to find tenants. Skilled workers were scarce. Surviving peasants could, quite literally, walk away and find better terms elsewhere. This is where the pattern of legibility and extraction reappears in a new form. Medieval lords and kings did not have census systems as detailed as later states, but they did have manorial rolls, rent lists, feudal registers. They had a mental map of who owed what, to whom, and on what land. Those records were based on a pre-plague world, fixed dues, fixed corvée, fixed rents. When labour became scarce, that map began to tear away from reality. For landlords, the obvious response was to try to hold the line, to insist that a peasant who had always owed 3 days' work per week still owed 3 days, that rents remain the same, that a wage for a reaper or a mason stay at traditional levels. For surviving workers, the obvious response was to ask, why? If your children had died, if your village was half empty, if you watched fields go to weeds because there were not enough hands, the old deal, that dense web of obligations in exchange for protection and providence, no longer looked so sacred. In many places, wages did begin to rise. Manorial court records show peasants negotiating better terms, commuting labour services into money rents, or simply leaving to work elsewhere. Towns, hungry for labour, could offer coin wages and relative freedom. New urban opportunities opened, both legal and illicit. Authorities pushed back. In England, for instance, the Crown issued the Ordinance and Statute of Labourers in the 1340s and 1350s, attempting to freeze wages at pre-plague levels and tie workers to their localities. Similar efforts to regulate pay and bind labour appear elsewhere. These were attempts to reassert legibility, to fix people back into the pre-existing grid of obligations, to pull reality back into the columns of the accounts. But the bargaining landscape had changed too much. Underneath the statutes and edicts, a quiet renegotiation unfolded. Some lords, unable to enforce traditional dues, accepted lower rents or more favourable tenancies just to keep land occupied. Others leaned harder on those who remained, fueling, simmering resentment. That resentment occasionally boiled over. In 1358, in northern France, the Jacquerie uprising saw peasants attack castles and noble households, fueled by anger at war taxes, military depredations and feudal exactions. In 1381 in England, the peasants' revolt, tied to poll taxes and attempts to clamp down on labour mobility, brought armed bands into London, demanding an end to serfdom, lower rents, and changes in governance. These revolts were crushed. The old order did not vanish overnight. But the trust that underpinned that order had been deeply shaken. The Church, too, faced a crisis of legitimacy. In a world where religious institutions had claimed a central role in mediating between God and humanity, the sudden indiscriminate mortality of the Black Death was a theological earthquake. Priests and monks died in large numbers, having gone among the sick. Those who survived were often overworked, sometimes less educated replacements. In some regions, people blamed the clergy for failing to avert the plague. In others, they depended on them more intensely. Flagellant movements, popular piety, and accusations against marginalized groups all flared. At the same time, the papacy itself was entering a period of division, the Avignon papacy, followed by the Great Schism, when multiple claimants to the papal throne competed for allegiance. At exactly the moment when people might have craved a unified spiritual authority, they got competing popes and ecclesiastical bureaucracies. Institutional credibility frayed on both the secular and sacred sides. The pattern we've seen elsewhere emerges in a medieval key. An extraction system of feudal dues, tithes, and traditional obligations had made the world predictable for those in power. Lords could anticipate labour, bishops could anticipate tithes, kings could anticipate taxes from a web of manors and towns. When the demographic shock hit, that predictability vanished. Instead of a hydraulic machine failing under climate strain, you have a social machine failing under mortality strain. The written obligations on parchment no longer matched what battered, surviving communities could or would deliver. Some elites tried to double down on legibility, fixing wages, restricting movement, reaffirming serfdom, enforcing tithes. Others gradually shifted strategies. Over the following centuries, the long arc bends toward higher wages for many forms of labour, more tenant autonomy, and a loosening of rigid serfdom in parts of Western Europe. Lords converted demesne land to pasture, needing fewer workers. Peasants negotiated hereditary leases. Markets in land and labour deepened. Technological adoption crept forward too. With fewer hands, the incentive to save labour grew. Watermills and windmills spread more widely. New plough designs, better harnesses, shifts in crop rotation. Some of these trends predated the plague, but demographic pressure sharpened the appetite for efficiency. In towns, textile production and other crafts experimented with more organised, sometimes proto-industrial arrangements. State formation also began to change its character. Monarchs, facing a patchier, more mobile population and more monetised economies, leaned increasingly on taxes in coin, on indirect levies through trade and consumption, and on professional armies funded by those revenues. The long medieval pattern of kings relying on feudal levies from their vassals gave way, bit by bit, to something more recognisably modern, centralised fiscal systems, standing forces, bureaucracies. All of this did not happen because of the Black Death alone. War, climate fluctuations, intellectual shifts, and countless local contingencies played their parts. But the plague reset the demographic baseline in a way that forced a renegotiation of who owed what to whom, and, crucially, forced a renegotiation of legitimacy. If a lord could no longer credibly protect his tenants from violence and famine, on what basis did he claim their enforced labour? If the Church could not explain or avert overwhelming death, on what basis did it claim unquestioned obedience and tithe? The answers that emerged, more contractual relationships, more emphasis on written law, more appeal to individual conscience, would shape the late medieval and early modern worlds. Once again the pattern surfaces. When institutions fail to protect, they must either adapt the story they tell about why they deserve to rule, or watch that story erode. By the time caravels began to cross the Atlantic, Europe was already a post-plague, partially renegotiated society. Wages, rents, state power, and church authority had all shifted under the pressure of that demographic shock. Which raises a new question. What happens when a world that has just been reset by disease becomes the sender of disease? When the same ships carrying silver, spices, and slaves also carry microbes to other continents, triggering resets far more catastrophic than anything Europe itself endured? To see that, we have to step onto those ships, into the age when legibility, extraction, and trust go global. Step onto the deck, wood underfoot, canvas above, a smell of tar, salt, sweat, and something else, risk. By the late 1400s and early 1500s, European societies had already been bent and stretched by plague, war, and slow fiscal experimentation. Kings were learning to count more carefully. Merchants were threading town to town with coin and credit. Small bureaucracies were keeping ledgers, issuing writs, measuring fields. Now they turned toward the sea. For most of human history, oceans had been barriers, dangerous margins at the edge of maps. Coastal peoples fished and traded along shorelines, but there was no single continuous world system. You could live and die in one region without ever feeling the direct pressure of distant empires. The so-called Age of Exploration began to change that. Caravels and naos, lateen sails and improved compasses, port-to-land charts and ocean-going navigation. None of these appeared overnight, but in the 15th and 16th centuries they cohered into something new, reliable long-distance sea routes that could be repeated on schedule. Oceans stopped being edges and started becoming highways. Portuguese ships rounded Africa and reached India. Spanish fleets crossed the Atlantic to the Caribbean and the American mainland. Soon Dutch, English and French vessels joined in, probing coasts, establishing forts and ports, folding distant shores into their mental maps. With those routes came new commodity chains that simply had not existed at global scale before. Silver mined in Potosi in the high Andes could be shipped to Panama, hauled across the isthmus, loaded again, sent to Seville, or sent west across the Pacific on Manila galleons to end up in Ming China. Sugar grown on brutal plantations in the Caribbean could be boiled into molasses, refined in European ports, consumed by urban workers, or distilled into rum that would circulate in African and American trade networks. Spices, porcelain, silk, furs, tobacco, coffee, cocoa, slaves, timber, cotton, goods that had once moved slowly through many local middlemen, now flowed along transoceanic arteries, timed to winds and currents, synchronized with imperial demands. This was a rewiring of the world system. Not every region was plugged in equally or immediately, but the direction was clear. More and more of the planet's people and resources were being drawn into a single interlinked economic network, with a handful of maritime powers trying to sit at the central nodes. In that sense, the Age of Exploration is another reset, not of one civilization, but of how civilizations interacted. And just like earlier resets, the engine was not just ships and guns. It was also microbes. When Europeans crossed the Atlantic, they carried with them a biological cargo they did not understand. Pathogens to which many Eurasian and African populations had long, deep familiarity, and to which most indigenous Americans had none. Smallpox, measles, influenza, typhus, and other diseases moved faster than any conquistador. In many places, waves of epidemic disease arrived ahead of sustained European settlement, transmitted through trade contacts, captured slaves, shipwrecks, and overland networks. Estimates vary widely and scholars debate exact numbers, but the broad pattern is grimly consistent. In many regions of the Americas, indigenous populations appear to have fallen by more than half within a century or two of first sustained contact. In some localized areas, the drop may have been even steeper. The ethical weight of that demographic collapse is heavy. It was not just germs in an abstract sense. Disease spread interacted with conquest, slavery, forced labor, displacement, famine, and deliberate violence. Some European observers recognized, even at the time, that their systems of extraction, encomiendas, repartimientos, plantations, were hastening indigenous death. Others justified it with religious or racial theories, or simply turned away. From the perspective of the pattern we've been following, this was a reset of staggering magnitude. Entire polities, Aztec, Inca, Mississippian chiefdoms, countless smaller nations saw their populations hammered. The human infrastructure that sustained terraces, chinampas, causeways and ritual calendars was eaten away. Traditional systems of tribute, redistribution, and legitimacy were shattered or warped under the combined weight of foreign disease and foreign rule. Yet the colonial project did not stop when local labour collapsed. It adapted, and here the new extraction technologies matter. If earlier empires had relied on scribes, tax farmers, and temple granaries, the early modern maritime empires added something sharper: Double-entry bookkeeping, state-sanctioned charters, joint stock companies, and standardized colonial bureaucracies. Double-entry accounting, pioneered in Italian city-states and spread through merchant networks, allowed traders and states to track debits and credits, profits and losses across complex webs of transactions. It made capital more legible. You could see, on paper, how a shipment of sugar or silver rippled through ledgers in Lisbon, Antwerp, or Amsterdam. Chartered companies took this one step further. The English East India Company, the Dutch VOC, and others were not just merchant guilds. They were hybrid creatures. Private corporations granted public powers. Their royal charters gave them rights to wage war, make treaties, coin money, and administer territories in far-off lands. Investors at home could buy shares, spreading risk and pooling capital. The ocean became not just a highway for goods, but for contracts. Colonial administrations amplified this. Spanish viceroyalties in New Spain and Peru developed elaborate systems of audits, surveys, and legal appeals. Portuguese Brazil had its own governorates. The French and English carved out proprietary colonies, crown colonies, and later more standardized provincial structures. Officials filed reports on harvests, mines, trade volumes, and souls converted to Christianity. To tax and govern across oceans, you needed more detailed knowledge of people and land. Legibility scaled up. Maps multiplied, not as decorative curiosities, but as tools of control. Coastlines were charted, rivers traced, boundaries drawn and redrawn according to treaties, wars and royal whims. Jesuit missionaries produced detailed accounts of languages, customs, and geographies in China, the Americas, and elsewhere, feeding European curiosity and imperial planning. Censuses and enumerations appeared in new guises. Colonial authorities counted tribute payers, categorized castas in Spanish America, distinguished between whites, blacks, indios, mestizos, and numerous other gradations. In parts of the Caribbean and North America, slave codes and registers tried to fix enslaved Africans into legal categories that defined what they could or could not do, where they could or could not go. Racial categories which existed in various forms in many societies hardened into more systematic written frameworks tied explicitly to law, labour, and taxation. All of this extended the grid of legibility. Where earlier empires had primarily mapped fields, villages, and temples, these new systems tried to map bodies, lineages, and identities, often in ways that served the extraction of labour and wealth. And as always, that grid did not align cleanly with human realities. Indigenous polities across the Americas did not simply surrender legitimacy to distant kings. They negotiated, resisted, revolted, and adapted. Some forged alliances with one European power against another. Others moved, hid, or maintained parallel institutions underneath the colonial veneer. In the Andes, for instance, Andean nobles used Spanish courts to defend local rights, even as they led or inspired rebellions when demands became unbearable. In central Mexico, Nahua communities maintained town councils and landholding traditions under the surface of Spanish legal categories. Enslaved Africans and their descendants also contested the new order. Shipboard rebellions, maroon communities in jungles and mountains, day-to-day resistance on plantations, occasional large-scale uprisings, these were all forms of rejecting the legitimacy claims of slave owners and colonial states. Some African polities on the other side of the Atlantic tried to control, redirect, or profit from the slave trade, with complex and often tragic consequences. Within Europe, too, there were fractures. Merchants and financiers, enriched by overseas ventures, sometimes clashed with older aristocracies. Philosophers and theologians argued about the moral status of indigenous peoples and enslaved Africans. Church and crown wrestled over control of missions, tithes, and colonial policy. Competing stories of legitimacy proliferated. To European crowns, Empire was justified by discovery, papal bulls, and a sense of civilizational and religious mission. To many colonized peoples, legitimacy still resided in ancestral lands, local deities, kinship, or long-standing political traditions. To some merchants, legitimacy flowed from contracts and market outcomes. To enslaved and dispossessed people, it might reside in a god who promised justice beyond the plantation fence. Trust fractured along these lines. When colonial authorities promised protection in exchange for tribute, but failed to prevent raids, famines, or abuses by local officials, their claims rang hollow. When joint stock companies promised investors returns while underpaying sailors and soldiers, mutinies and desertions followed. When maps and censuses tried to fix identities that people understood differently, quiet and overt forms of evasion emerged. The reset outcome of this era was not a single fallen empire. It was a recentering of power. By the 18th century, wealth that had once pooled primarily in certain Asian, Middle Eastern, and Mediterranean hubs was increasingly being siphoned into Western European ports and treasuries. Atlantic economies built on silver, sugar, and slaves underwrote new forms of state power. London, Amsterdam, and Paris grew into financial and political centres whose decisions could ripple across continents. A world economy in something close to the modern sense had taken shape. It was not yet fully industrial, steam engines were only beginning to appear. But the basic wiring diagram was in place. Oceans as integrated highways, credit and accounting as the nervous system, colonial administrations as outposts of legibility and extraction, and millions of people often unwillingly folded into a single turbulent network. Once again, the pattern holds. New technologies of movement and measurement made more of the world visible to central authorities. New forms of accounting and corporate organization turned that visibility into extractable value. Trust frayed where protection and justice lagged behind exploitation. Resistance and alternative claims to legitimacy grew in the cracks. And, quietly, another ingredient was fermenting inside this global system: energy. The same trading and accounting circuits that moved silver and sugar were beginning to move coal, iron, and ideas about machines. The next reset would not be centered on oceans alone, but on what was buried beneath old landscapes. To reach that, we have to follow the money and the steam into the age when fossil fuel and bureaucracy fused into a single planetary engine. Follow the coal. In the 18th and 19th centuries, the same European ports fattened by silver and sugar began to plug into something older and quieter: compressed sunlight laid down in swamp forests hundreds of millions of years ago. Coal. At first it was just another fuel. Heat for homes, fire for forges, but then people started bolting fire to pistons. Steam engines in mines pumped out water, steam engines in mills turned spindles, steam engines on rails and ships moved goods and people with a speed that would have seemed supernatural a few centuries earlier. From the perspective of our pattern, something profound was happening. Earlier empires had run on muscle, human and animal, plus a trickle of wind and water. Their administrators were limited by how far a courier could ride, how fast a scribe could copy, how much grain could be carried on carts or barges. Fossil fuel changed that constraint. Cheap, concentrated energy did not just make more stuff. It made more administration possible. Trains and telegraphs linked capitals to frontiers. Steamships kept colonial garrisons on a kind of mechanical leash, resupplied on timetables that could be printed in newspapers. Later, electricity turned nights into workdays and let offices hum with typewriters, telephones, and eventually computers. The result was a new kind of complexity: energy-amplified administration. States and corporations could coordinate logistics on scales that would have stunned a Roman prefect or a Ming official. Wheat from the American Midwest, coal from Wales, cotton from India, nitrates from Chile, rubber from the Congo, each could be routed through ports, refineries, factories and markets with increasing precision. Finance scaled with it. Railway companies and industrial firms issued bonds and shares, drawing in investors far from the tracks or smokestacks. Central banks emerged to stabilize currency systems shaken by booms and busts. Insurance markets spread risk across continents. Accounting became more detailed, more standardized, more embedded in law. By the late 19th and early 20th centuries, states were counting and classifying on a new level. Modern censuses, universal conscription, compulsory schooling, national ID systems, standardized time zones, each was a way of making populations legible enough to tax, to mobilize, to educate, to surveil. The grid thickened then. Slowly, another layer grew over it. Signals. Telegraphs turned into telephones, telephones into radio, radio into television, television into digital networks. Information that had once taken weeks to cross an empire now moved at near-instant speeds, along copper wires, fibre optics, and through the air itself. If earlier civilizations had faced a trade-off between scale and awareness, more territory but cruder knowledge, modern states began to enjoy both. They could be vast and granular, global and intimate. Think of modern passports, banking regulations, GPS-guided shipping, bar-coded inventories in warehouses, digital tax records, health databases, social media profiles. Each is a little window into human life, framed in a way that can be stored, searched, and acted on. From the pattern's point of view, this is legibility turned up to a new setting. And as always, legibility exists to feed extraction. In older worlds, extraction meant grain, labour, conscripts, ritual offerings, maybe corvée work on canals and walls. In the modern world, the list expands. Income taxes, corporate taxes, social insurance contributions, tariffs, fees, fines, user charges. Debt becomes a structural feature, not just a personal misfortune. Households take mortgages and student loans. Governments issue bonds to finance wars, railways, welfare states and bailouts. Corporations leverage themselves to expand, merge, or survive downturns. Interest flows bind future labour and future taxes to present decisions. If a Bronze Age peasant owed grain to the temple at harvest time, a modern worker can spend decades owing a portion of every paycheck to a lender. And then there's the less tangible extractions. Data. Every credit card purchase, phone call, website visit, GPS ping, loyalty card scan, and app login leaves a trace. Those traces coalesce into profiles: where you live, what you buy, who you talk to, what you read, how long you linger before scrolling. First, these patterns helped companies sell more effectively and manage risk. Then they became the raw material for a new business model, platforms built to harvest and monetize attention itself. If a medieval lord could demand days of labour from peasants, and an industrial boss could demand 8 to 12 hours in the factory, modern systems can slip into the in-between spaces: commutes, evenings, waiting rooms, bedtimes. Minutes chipped away, not in fields or workshops, but in feeds and notifications. Tax, debt, data, attention. Conceptually, they echo older forms of extraction. A central system that makes people visible then translates that visibility into steady flows, whether of money, information, or time. The difference is the resolution. Modern institutions can see more, faster, and act more precisely. They can adjust interest rates for entire economies, micro-target advertisements, flag suspicious transactions, or automatically garnish wages. To keep such a system stable, you need more than force. You need narrative. Earlier societies had myths, rituals, genealogies, and philosophies that told people why their rulers were legitimate, why tribute made sense, why sacrifices were necessary. Modern societies layer new kinds of stories on top. States and corporations tell stories about growth, progress, security, and freedom. Political parties tell stories about threats and saviors. Media organizations tell stories about who counts as us and what counts as normal. In the 20th century, propaganda became a technical craft. Totalitarian regimes used it openly, with rallies, posters, controlled newspapers, and radio speeches. Democracies use gentler versions: public relations campaigns, patriotic films, educational curricula, press briefings. Later, marketing techniques and political messaging began to merge. Focus groups, polling, psychological profiling, all ways of tuning a narrative to an audience. The information environment thickened just as the administrative grid had. By the early 21st century, much of this had moved online. Traditional gatekeepers, editors, broadcasters, official censors lost their monopolies, but new bottlenecks appeared: search algorithms, social media feeds, recommendation engines. Narrative management became less about a single coherent story and more about shaping the currents in which many stories swim. And here is where we can start to see modern versions of the trust fracture. When people sense that institutions are increasingly efficient at extracting taxes, fees, rents, data, attention, but less reliable at providing protection, fairness, or a sense of meaning, skepticism grows. You can see it in rising political polarization, where groups inhabit different narrative worlds and struggle to agree on basic facts. You can see it in institutional skepticism, falling trust in governments, media, banks, universities, sometimes even in science itself, especially when decisions seem opaque or self-serving. You can see it in the search for localized alternatives. Some people turn to local food networks, mutual aid groups, community currencies, worker cooperatives. Others turn to alternative media ecosystems, parallel education structures, new religious movements, or decentralized digital projects that promise to escape traditional hierarchies. These responses echo earlier patterns. When the late Roman state struggled to protect its provinces, local elites and bishops stepped into the gap. When dynasties in China lost the mandate in people's eyes, sects and secret societies flourished. When colonial authorities overreached, hidden transcripts and underground movements multiplied. Legibility, without convincing legitimacy, tends to produce not just rebellion, but multiplication of smaller competing worlds. The temptation, standing in the middle of our own moment, is to declare the story already written, to say this much complexity must collapse, this level of extraction must trigger a reset, this degree of polarization must end in fragmentation. But history resists that kind of certainty. Some heavily centralized systems have indeed broken apart dramatically. Han China, Western Rome, certain caliphates and empires. Others have bent, reformed, and continued under new rules. Japan after the Meiji Restoration, and then after World War II, some European states after revolutions and decolonization, even large federations that periodically renegotiate their internal contracts. Fossil energy, too, does not point to a single outcome. It enabled unprecedented growth in population, wealth, and technological capacity. It also loaded the atmosphere and oceans with greenhouse gases, driving climate shifts whose full implications we are only beginning to feel. Those shifts could stress food systems, water supplies, coastal cities, and migration patterns in ways that resemble past climatic shocks, but overlaid on a globally networked civilization that has never existed before. So where does that place us in the pattern? If we step back and squint, it looks something like this. We live in a civilization whose legibility and extraction systems are more detailed, more global, and more tightly coupled than any before. Fossil energy has supercharged both the productive and administrative sides of life. Information networks have woven billions of people into overlapping webs of narrative and surveillance. In many places, trust in central institutions is fraying, especially where people feel that costs and benefits are unevenly distributed, that rules are opaque, or that crises, financial, political, ecological, are mishandled. At the same time, new forms of organisation are germinating. Local experiments, digital communities, transnational movements, hybrid public-private systems. Some may wither, some may scale. Some may be co-opted into the very structures they were meant to replace. We could be near a major reset, or we could be in the middle of a long, messy transition to different forms of complexity. The past offers patterns, not prophecies. What it does suggest is that resets rarely come from a single factor. They emerge when energy regimes, administrative techniques, and legitimacy stories stop aligning. When the flows that feed the centre, whether grain, taxes, oil or data, no longer feel tolerable or meaningful to those providing them, and when alternatives, however rough, start to look more real than the promises from above. If we are, as some argue, the seventh large-scale civilization in a deep pattern, then we are also its experimenters. We inherit a bottleneck history that's selected for adaptability and cooperation under pressure. We also inherit infrastructures and habits that can lock us into dangerous paths. As you listen, somewhere, servers hum, container ships cross oceans, satellites pass overhead, algorithms reshuffle streams of information. All of it is part of a vast humming reset engine powered by ancient sunlight and human attention. Whether that engine drives us into a wall or carries us into a different kind of equilibrium depends on countless small decisions and a few large ones spread across billions of lives. In the final stretch, we'll pull the pieces together. Not to predict an ending, but to hold the pattern gently and ask what it means to be living inside a civilization that can see its own fractures forming in real time. So let's put the pieces on the table one last time and look at them without rushing. Across Sumer and Akkad, the pharaohs and their provinces, the Indus cities, the Maya kingdoms, Rome, the Chinese dynasties, Angkor's canals, the Black Death, the empires of sail, and our fossil-fueled present, a simple pattern keeps peeking through. First, someone in charge finds a way to see more. They count fields and households, measure harvests, map canals and roads, register land and labour, log ships and cargoes, track wages and debts, tabulate births and deaths. In our time, they add browsing histories, location traces, transaction logs, biometrics. Legibility. Then they use that visibility to pull more into the centre. Grain, corvée days, silver, slaves, tithes, tribute, rents, taxes, bond payments, data, attention. Some of it funds protection and public works. Some feeds courtly splendour, standing armies or complex financial claims on the future. Extraction, for a while the bargain holds. People may grumble, but the roads work. The granaries open in lean years, the irrigation flows, the markets function. The gods or ideologies seem to be listening. The story of why everything is arranged this way feels, if not fair, then at least comprehensible. Then a shock hits. Sometimes it is climate, droughts in the Bronze Age, Nile failures, little ice ages, monsoon shifts. Sometimes it is disease, plague in Athens, smallpox in the Americas, the Black Death, influenza, new pandemics. Sometimes it is invasion, civil war, technological disruption, financial panic, or a slow erosion of soil and forests. The stress exposes where the system is hollow. Perhaps the centre has overpromised and understored. Perhaps roads and armies are excellent at moving tribute, but not so good at moving aid. Perhaps the ruling stories sound tinny when granaries stay closed, wages fall or rescue comes late. Trust breaks, not everywhere at once, and not always with a shout. Sometimes as a quiet shift, taxes evaded, edicts ignored, prayers said with less conviction, local leaders listen to more than distant ones. Power fragments, provincial governors stop obeying. City-states go their own way. Local cults and sects multiply. Bandits become warlords. Warlords become kings. Old capitals shrink while frontier towns and monasteries, hill forts and harbour cities, or merchant enclaves take the lead. In the rubble and confusion, people improvise new arrangements, different tax rules, different property norms, different gods or philosophies, different ways of storing food, raising armies, sharing information. Some experiments fail quickly. Others become the bones of a new order. A new bargain forms: legibility, extraction, trust, fragmentation, renegotiation. Not as a clockwork law, but as a rhythm that shows up often enough to be worth noticing. Looking back over the cases, some parts of this rhythm stand on firmer ground than others. The evidence that complex societies build legibility tools, censuses, land surveys, record-keeping, standardized measures is about as solid as archaeology and documents can be. Clay tablets, stone stelae, papyri, bamboo slips, parchment, printed forms, digital databases. We can see the counting and classifying grow more detailed over time. The link between legibility and extraction is also clear. Where we find careful records, we almost always find flows being channeled: grain to temples, labour to walls and canals, silver to treasuries, taxes to bureaucracies, payments to creditors. The point of making people and things visible more often than not is to attach obligations to them. The shakier parts are about motives and feelings. We can infer that trust broke around certain collapses because people abandoned cities, stopped repairing monumental buildings, hoarded coins, or wrote laments and edicts against corruption. We can see power fragment in coin hoards, in new fortresses, in regional styles of pottery and worship, in competing chronicles. But how it felt inside a Sumerian farmer's chest or a Mayan craftsperson's mind as the old order wobbled, that we can only approach with careful guesses. The same is true for our own time. We have polls, protests, opinion pieces, elections, memes, leaks. They suggest rising skepticism in many places, yet translating that into a single narrative, trust is collapsing, therefore a reset is inevitable, would be more fantasy than history. What the cases collectively suggest is not a prophecy, but a set of questions that tend to matter when a civilization strains. How concentrated is the knowledge of how things work? How many layers of redundancy exist in food, water, energy, and information systems? How much do elites and ordinary people share the same risks? How easily can local communities solve problems without waiting for a distant capital or platform to notice them? And what stories are people telling themselves about why they are cooperating at all? If you're listening to this while you drift towards sleep, you are not about to redesign global institutions. But patterns this large still trickle down into the scale of a single life, a single neighbourhood. History suggests a few gentle lessons. Resilience tends to live in redundancies. Multiple food sources, not just one crop. Multiple ways to move water, not just one canal or pipe. Multiple skills per person, not just one hyper-specialized niche. Multiple lines of support, not just one employer, one platform, one patron. Trust travels best in shorter loops. People who see each other often, who share meals, tools, stories, and small favors, usually weather shocks better than isolated individuals linked only by distant, impersonal systems. Villages in drought, towns in wartime, neighborhoods in blackouts. Again and again, mutual aid and local trust soften the blow. Narratives matter too. Civilizations do not just run on grain and oil and data. They run on shared explanations: what counts as fair, what sacrifices are acceptable, who is we, and who decides. When official stories drift too far from lived experience, parallel stories grow in the cracks. Seeking out truthful, nuanced narratives, ones that admit uncertainty, that distinguish evidence from speculation, that can say "we don't know yet," is its own form of quiet preparation. It does not guarantee a soft landing, But it makes it easier to navigate ambiguity without being pulled entirely into fear or denial. This is where the idea of us being the seventh civilization comes in. It is tempting to treat it as a cosmic fact, a hidden code in history that proves we are heading for a specific outcome. But it may be more useful to hold it like a lens. If you look through that lens, certain features of our world sharpen into focus. The intensity of our legibility systems, the scale of our extraction, the subtle creaks in our legitimacy narratives, the tiny experiments sprouting in the margins. Then, when the lens no longer helps, you can set it down. Civilizational counting, first, second, seventh, is a way of organizing stories, not a law of nature. Other historians would slice the past differently. Some would say there is no single we at all, just overlapping worlds and rhythms. Holding the pattern gently means staying curious, without needing it to be final. So as you lie there, somewhere between waking and sleep, you might let a few questions float to the surface, without needing answers tonight. Which institutions in your life have actually earned your trust, not just demanded it? How do they behave when things go wrong? Do they share costs or push them downward? Do they make themselves legible to you, clear in their rules and records, or only ask that you be legible to them? What does a fair bargain look like at the scale of a job, a city, a nation, a network? How would you know if the bargain had quietly changed? And if a reset, small or large, arrived in your lifetime, what would you want to carry through it? Which relationships, skills, stories and habits feel worth preserving on the other side of a shock? You do not have to solve any of this now. For tonight, it is enough to notice that you stand in a long line of survivors, descendants of bottlenecks and collapses and reinventions, listening in the half-dark while another civilization hums around you. If this journey through rises and resets has kept you company, I'd be grateful if you'd gently support it. When you have a quiet moment, please like this video, subscribe to the channel, and share it with someone who might enjoy falling asleep to deep time and slow patterns. And in the comments, I'd love to hear from you. What time is it right now? And where in the world are you listening from? Those little dots of time and place are their own kind of map, a softer legibility, offered freely, threading our separate nights into a shared story.